Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we're here for week 3 of the LEC here in the winter split. It's the final regular season week already here in the winter split. After today, we're going to know our first 2 teams that are officially eliminated from the LEC winter split. We're going to know our 8 that end up making the playoff stage. Of course, it's all technically one playoff stage now, but the format is essentially still the same, where you're separated into groups and you play some best of 3s, and then top 4 becomes best of 5s. It's essentially the same thing, just I guess technically, told a little bit differently. But today we're going to find out how that bracket ends up shaking out, because the regular season will end off today. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on every week up until this point, weeks 1 and 2, as well as my primer, you can check out the LEC playlist. That's going to be linked up in the iCard right now. Obviously, I recommend you check those videos out before you check this one out, so you can get an idea of what I think of these teams going into this week. But very important stuff, and I'd love to know what you guys thought of this week down in the comment section below. Did you think, the teams that ended up doing well were going to do well, or were you surprised by maybe the overachieving or underachieving of some of the teams here in week number 3? Would love to hear your thoughts and feedback on everything LEC related down in the comment section below. Of course, also let me know what you think of the playoff bracket and what you think might happen there. But in today's video, of course, if you are new to the channel, what we do here is we're going to go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages of each team. We're going to give a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game at the end of the week. We'll be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Also very quickly talk about, I guess, like full end of year, end of split awards, the regular season awards, if you will. I don't want to make a full video on them because in the LEC it's just a lot more up in the air, but I'll quickly talk about who I would personally pick for MVP and for my first team All-Pros, because I think those are pretty important to talk about. But I'll also be giving you my updated power rankings at the end of the week. That's mostly going to be, I guess you could say, context dependent, because we're getting into a stage where you're really only playing best of 3s and best of 5s at that point, and so you could be a really good team and just face another really good team and be in a bad spot. But, power rankings are still important to see where I determine, or where I feel like these teams are kind of heading direction-wise for the rest of the split. But with all that being said, it's time to jump into the analysis. Sorry for the long intro. We get to jump into day number 1 to kick us off. And honestly, the game that I was the most excited to see all week long kicked off our week. It was Team Heretics taking on Team BDS. And BDS was able to pick up a really big win here. Day 1 is actually a very important day for how the rest of the standings are going to shake out in a lot of different ways. None more so than this series, which really was like, is BDS real or not? Because Heretics has been a good team. They've really only lost to good teams over the course of this split up until this point, but BDS really manhandled them, especially in the back half of this game, and they were able to take it pretty cleanly. Their team fighting was immaculate. I mean, this BDS team is about as clean as you can possibly get at this stage. Really like what they've been doing. Team Heretics not nearly as clean, making a lot of mistakes in this game. And generally, some of the ghosts and some of the narratives that have come to haunt some of these players over the past couple of years kind of came into fruition on this one. So we'll talk about that as we get into it. But player of the game for me, pretty obviously, going to go to Nuke in the mid lane on this Azir. Nuke has just been so consistently above average since coming over here to BDS. Or I guess I should say since last year. His first year on BDS was also not very good. But, since 2023, since he actually started getting some teammates around him, he's just been a very good mid laner. It's hard for me to say that he's one of the best mid laners in the LEC, because that's a very high bar to end up hitting, but he often performs like one of the best mid laners in the LEC. Maybe he's not the most consistent, but he is a very good player, and this was another example of that. His team fighting in the back half of this game was perfect. His positioning was amazing. His damage output was great. His ultimates were fantastic on the Azir, and he definitely deserved the player of the game here. Now, I do think this was more up for debate than maybe some people might consider it to be, because I think Adam in the top lane was also phenomenal in this game on the Cassante. Want to quickly touch upon the idea that Adam is only good on his champions and that he can't play meta, or that he can't play tanks, or that he needs resources. I think the only thing that he has proven over the past year has been that that is just not true. He has been good in 90% of his games, whether or not he's playing his gods, champions, or not. This guy is very versatile, and he's very talented. He's super good in lane, and he's a great team fighter. I think there is really nothing else to stop me from saying that he is one of the best top laners in the LEC. I see a lot of people that don't necessarily match up with that opinion, and I just don't know what else he needs to show you. This was a Cassante game, a champion that everybody is saying, oh, Adam can't can't play it. He can't play it at a high level. And he came out here, and this was one of the more impressive K'Sante performances that we've seen all split. Obviously, that champion is ridiculously busted, but Adam really went out there and made it look ridiculously busted, which other players have not always been able to do as consistently. So, I'm all in on Adam. I think he's a fantastic top laner, one of the top 2 to 3 in the LEC. Basically, no question in my eyes, and I think he again showed that off in this game. Him and Nuke were definitely the stars, but Labrov with some fantastic CC chaining. Sheo was in on that action as well. Both of them did a phenomenal job. There was one particular fight in the back half of this game where it was just a perfect layering of CC from the Vi and the Rel and the Azir and the K'Sante and even the Jhin, where it's just unplayable. It's literally unplayable for Heretics. No matter how well they played it, they were never going to win that fight. That's the stage that BDS is playing at right now, and that's why they are so scary moving into the playoffs in the back half of the year, or the back half of the split here, I should say. And then for Heretics on the other side, honestly, I don't think this game was nearly as bad as people are making it out to be. You're going to see some comments about how Heretics look completely outclassed in this, and while I agree with that, I think that has more to do with BDS looking like they're one of the best teams in the West, rather than Heretics just being this awful, horrible team. I think most of these players played well for most of the game. Obviously, there were some pretty big mistakes down the stretch. Dud of the game is going to go to Perks in the mid lane. Tristana Wing into 3 members of the team only to get CC chained when you are the carry, when you have all the gold, is a pretty big oopsie, a pretty big game-losing play. But up until that point, Perks was actually really good in this game, and so I don't want to sit here and criticize him entirely. Worth noting, when I talked about the ghosts, Perks has been pretty notoriously bad in the final week of regular seasons, basically every year of his career, even going back to the G2 days. I don't really know why that is. Maybe it's just a lapse of, concentration, of focus, or whatever. Maybe you're getting close to the playoffs and he just starts to mentally check out, but it's kind of been a trend for Perks. It was definitely a problem for him on Vitality, and it was a problem in this series, or in this game. I'm not going to talk about the rest of the week, but we'll certainly see how that ends up playing out. But at least in this game, if Perks doesn't make that bad decision, they actually have a shot of being able to win some of these fights. I don't think they win them anyways, but Perks certainly didn't help with that major mistake towards the back half of the game, even if he was the one with all the gold going into that fight. I don't think Flacken and Kaiser played particularly well, and I really don't think Wunder and Jankos played particularly well. I think Wunder on the Rumble was not very good in this game. That's a champion that has looked very dominant globally, especially here in the LEC, where there really just aren't a lot of clean answers, and Adam just outplayed him in every single aspect. I know a lot of people consider Wunder to be a top 2, top 3 top laner in the league. I'm just not there right now. There are a lot of good top laners, and Adam is certainly one of them, and he showed that here, even against one of the strongest picks in the game. Adam pretty thoroughly outclassed Wunder, especially once we got to the team fight stage of the game. You want to see more aggressiveness from Jankos. I think he's having a much slower start to this year than he did in 2023. I don't know whether or not that's just the synergy between the players, or, maybe he's just not getting as many resources, but I don't think he's been nearly as good as he was for a bad Heretics team last year. Definitely something to monitor, but BDS is legit. That's the takeaway for me from this game, is that BDS is truly a dominant, elite, top-level team here in the LEC. It's going to be interesting to see how they end off their regular season, but right now they're on pace to be the number 1 seed going into the playoffs. And then moving on to game 2 here of day 1, another game that's going to give us a lot of information moving into the second half of this split. It's Vitality taking on SK Gaming, and SK picking up another win here. I feel like the magic has worn off a bit on SK after what was kind of a tumultuous week number 2. They had a pretty easy schedule in week 1 when they went 3-0, the only team to go 3-0 in week number 1, but things got a little bit more difficult, and I think they struggled a bit to catch up. Kind of reminded a lot of people, I think, of SK from last year, where they started off super hot and just weren't able to keep that momentum up. But I think this team is significantly more talented than SK was last year. I think jungle mid is a huge upgrade, and I think you've got a lot of options here for this team, and I think they showed that off here, because a lot of the progressions that we were really hoping to see this team make, I think they're really starting to actually make. It's not just top side of the map winning in ways that, are kind of expected. It's the bot lane actually showing that growth that I think we were all really hoping to see over the course of this split. For Vitality on the other side, this team has good players. They certainly have good moments. They're just not a very good, complete team right now. They're going to have some players that just are not consistent at all, and they're going to be big detriments to this team. We'll talk about it in this game, but for SK player of the game, pretty no-brainer. It's going to go to Exakick in the bot lane. He got a win on Lucian, boys. We did it. We got a Lucian win in the LEC. Nobody thought it was possible, but Exakick played him really well in this game. He was super active on the map, was definitely willing to try and trade for fights in the mid game, which is what you need to do on Lucian. Lucian. I think the big reason that Lucian has really struggled is a lot of people look at him as this lane-dominant bully, like, you know, along the lines of Kalista or Draven or something in that vein, when really what you want to do with Lucian is try to take a lot of these 3v3 skirmishes around objectives in the mid-game, because there really aren't a lot of other, you know, damage dealers, period, in the game that are going to be as useful in those types of fights. That's what Exekik was able to do at a super high level here. A lot of good setups coming in from DOS, but I want to give a big shout out to Isma in particular on the Maokai, who spent a lot of time and attention trying to make sure that Exekik was in a good spot. Isma has very quietly been fantastic at basically every role that he has played over the course of this split, whether that's been a carry, somebody who wants to gank at level 3 like he did in week 1, but even on the Maokai here where he's a little bit more passive, allowing his team to kind of generate their own leads and then, you know, securing them good fights in the mid game, like that's a really nice role for him as well. It just feels like he is a very good LEC jungler. Like that is the role that I think he has settled into, but Exekik and DOS have been phenomenal. DOS has also, I think, very quietly been amazing this split. I think that there are a lot of people that would look at this team and say that it's irrelevant and Niski that are carrying them, and Isma's had a couple of good games, but to me, DOS has been a major standout for how good SK has been over the course of the winter split so far. And Exekik has kind of been the player that I've been the least impressed with on the team, but for him to come out and have a good Lucian game and really, you know, kind of play in that vein, I think it's a really good thing. Irrelevant was fine, I guess, on the top side. He was the worst of the two top laners, but doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, the rest of the team won, and he didn't make any major errors. Niski hit a pretty big Orianna shockwave at the end of the game to catch VTO, and that was really his contribution. Generally, everybody on SK kind of played their part, but it was mostly this bot lane and Isma that I think really set this team up for success. And then for Vitality on the other side, mid-jungle continues to look like a problem when they're not playing against teams that are just mechanically worse than them. VTO is not comfortable on Corki. I don't know if it's just a champion he does not feel good on, but, you know, whatever it is, he does not look good on this champion, man. His positioning in the back half of this game was really bad, and I don't really know why that is. Corki should be relatively easy to position with. You've got yourself free escape with the W, especially if you don't have package up, but, you know, if you're in range of Lucian in the late game as Corki, like, that's your fault. Like, that is entirely your fault. If you're in range of Orianna Shockwave in the late game as Corki, that is entirely your fault. So, don't really know what happened to VTO. He was just kind of bad in this game, but dud of the game is going to go to Douglas in the jungle. Got completely manhandled in this matchup. The Vi is a very safe, very secure pick that honestly should have a ton of pressure in this draft, and it just didn't. You're playing a Corki Aphelios, you know, kind of scaling style comp that you really want to hit the late game with. Even something like the Aatrox is going to be fine in the back half of the game. You really don't need to flip the game on 3v3 skirmishes around Dragon. You really don't need to do that, but Douglas was playing so aggro without the backup of the rest of his team that it ended up being such a negative for Vitality overall. Jungle mid was concerning. Douglas is certainly not somebody that has blown me away with his time in the LEC, and I think this was another example of that. Worth noting, Photon and Karzi, I think, both had good games here. Karzi's scoreline's a little bit better than his positioning was. Really didn't do all that much. Certainly didn't make any mistakes. He didn't have any Karzi moments where he just stepped up and died, but his damage was rather low in this game. I think a lot of that was him just being scared to walk up. I don't blame him in this instance, but I think the lack of deaths more has to do with the lack of doing anything. I think Photon in particular played really well in the laning phase, kind of just beat Irrelevant. Yes, in a matchup that isn't all that bad for the Aatrox, but Photon continues to just win in lane and not have anything to do in the mid game because his team is already losing. Irrelevant continues to just be fine. He beats the bad players. He loses to the good players in lane. At least he's a very good team fighter, but that's who Irrelevant is. That's kind of what he's been his whole career. Photon did it again, and Photon is truly hard stuck on this Vitality team. I think there are times where it doesn't look like that because Karzi and Hilly will have good games. VTO will have good games, but man, when things go wrong, Photon really does look like the only competent player on this team. But generally for Vitality, I still think obviously they're in a much better spot than they were after week number 1. I think week 2 did a lot to inspire some confidence, and the fact that, you know, they weren't miserable across the board in this game at least shows that they are a relatively competent team. This should be a team that ends up making, you know, top 8, which I think is good considering the 0-3 start. But for SK, you know, they are a good team. 5-2 start to the season is really, really good for them. I want to see them actually compete against one of the better teams. Outside of Fnatic, they really have not looked good against teams in the upper section of the standings. You know, not saying that this is a team that's going to just destroy bottom teams and look bad against top teams, but I want to see what happens the rest of this week. There's going to be a lot of information to gather after the end of the final 2 days, but at least for now, obviously 5-2 puts SK in a really good spot to be one of the upper tier teams going into playoffs. Then moving on to game 3 here of day number 1, and a really fun one with a lot to talk about between Fnatic and Mad Lions here, and Mad's gonna pick up the win. They're gonna move to 4-3, push Fnatic down to 4-3 as well. Both of these teams, I think, definitely have their strengths and definitely have their weaknesses, but I think, honestly, Fnatic's weaknesses are getting exposed a bit more than they have been in previous weeks. I was really excited about this team because I was looking at Razork and Humanoid both actually playing relatively well in the regular season for once, and I'm like, man, if that's happening, you know, there's no way Fnatic ends up being a bad team. That was what was holding them back, but the problem is the reason that both of them are playing like really good players right now is because the rest of this team is just not living up to the hype. They're not living up to the billing right now, specifically this bot lane, which we will get into, but for Mad, this team is so scrappy, they're so fun, their drafts are so weird, and they're continuously so interesting to watch. They're not perfect, they don't make every single play in the mid game or late game perfectly. They're not, you know, the best macro team of all time or anything like that, but you know what? This team is a blast to watch, and I think that that is really more important, at least in my eyes. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, going to Alvaro in the support position. The Rakan was beautiful in the back half of this game. So many setups for the Azir and for the Xayah to be able to fight with. You know, a combo that we've seen very, you know, regularly, I would say, throughout pro history. These two are very often paired together in a lot of different metas because of the just kind of overall goodness that they give you throughout the entire game. You know, both of them are competent enough in lane to be able to survive, and both can turn into hyper carries with enough resources. And if you have a Rakan that's playing like this and setting up so many things for these two, you have an Ivern that's going to be sitting there trying to enable, and you've got another marksman just in case everything goes wrong on the top side. All of a sudden, this game becomes a lot of fun to watch, and I think a lot of that is because of Alvaro. Some of that is because of Merwin. I definitely want to say that. What a fun game on Varus top in the top lane. Clearly, they felt okay with giving over the K'Sante because of the Varus counter pick. You know, if I've said one thing on this channel, it's that you should probably take K'Sante away from Fnatic. Oscar looks like a completely different player when he has to play basically anything else at this level. They banned the Jax and the Yone instead. They wanted to take away aggressive picks that would be able to shut something like this down. They basically forced Fnatic into taking the K'Sante, and then they were like, oops, now we pick Varus, and all of a sudden, the game becomes a lot more fun. The Varus wasn't always perfect. There were moments where it looked relatively whatever, but, you know, watching him trade at buffs, you know, with Humanoid, with the Corki, and just kind of win them, it's really funny to watch a Varus top lane end up working that well. We've seen this pick in the past, but, you know, it was a lot of fun, I think, in this particular instance. Merwin's a very fun player to watch in general, but Alvaro really was the star here. Supa continues to impress a lot. His mechanics are ridiculous. He has honestly been, dare I say, the best AD carry in the LEC in the winter split. I mean, it's certainly up there. Like, ADC has been a very weak role, I would say, generally in the LEC this split. Not a lot of ADCs have really impressed me in terms of the consistency that they've offered. Supa's been good basically every game. There's been some, you know, up and down moments in terms of, like, wins and losses, but his mechanics have really translated, and honestly, he's been fantastic for this team. Frescoe has looked good. Elyoya's looked really good, and even this time on the Ivern, letting his young players kind of carry the game. You know, MDK's a fun team, and, you know, with this win, they put themselves in a pretty interesting spot moving into the second half of the week. But for Fnatic, there are clear problems with this team. First of all, the macro. This team's macro is just not very good. Razork and Humanoid are actually playing really well. Humanoid in particular, his mechanics are very on point right now. He made Corki look incredibly strong. Those packages are going to deal a lot of damage, and he was very relevant in some of the late game team fights. The problem was that the team's macro and decision making around where those fights and how those fights should happen was just bad. You know, pretty classic Fnatic and regular season stuff where they give up Nexus for basically nothing, right? Like, I don't really know what who's shot calling here, who's making the decisions, but they're pretty constantly making the wrong ones. I'm really concerned about it for Fnatic because outside of Humanoid and Razork, nobody on this team is playing well. Oscar looks good on K'Sante, but even in this one, when he got K'Sante, he made some mistakes and really wasn't all that relevant in the back half of this game. His laning has been really poor throughout the entirety of this split, and I just don't really know what to expect. Weird matchup. I'm going to give him a break, at least in this particular instance. But the real worry is this bot lane, which has genuinely been really bad. Like, there is no excuse that I can give them. They're not very good. I tried to tell people that June was not the player that a lot of people thought he was going to be. Coming into this split, I heard so much hype from him as this player that could potentially turn into a top 2, top 3 support from day one and really be, you know, somebody that pairs up with Noah and takes over the league. They've been a bottom 2, bottom 3 bot lane in the LEC this year. They are not good. Noah has been awful. He's going to get done of the game here. He has really done nothing over the course of this entire split. Even when this team has been winning games, it's been off of the top side of this map. Oscar's had a couple of good games on K'Sante, and Razork and Humanoid are winning. Noah and June have done nothing. I'm not surprised that this bot lane is bad, but it certainly is not good for Fnatic that this bot lane has been bad. They got mega gapped by Supa and Alvaro in this game, and if that's what you're going to get out of this bot lane, that seriously handicaps and hamstrings the upside of this team moving into any sort of playoff stage. I think it's a bit of a concern. Noah and June simply have to be better because they were not in this game. So for Fnatic, you got to figure that out. You're moving to 4-3. Obviously, you got some time, but you know, this is a short split. Like, you don't want to be stuck losing in the first round of the playoffs, you know, in the best of 3 stage just because your bot lane wasn't good enough to be able to survive against a team that you're more talented than. That would be a disaster ending of the year for Fnatic. And so you're really hoping they can figure stuff out, but at the very least, Humanoid's playing well still. And then for MDK, this team is a lot of fun. Do I think they're actually going to be able to compete, like, at the top of the standings? I don't think so. You know, it would take a lot, I think, for me to really think that in split 1, this team was going to be like a top 4 team. But, you know, they're certainly interesting, and we've seen them take down a top 4 team here, in my opinion, in Fnatic. And so never say never. I just think that right now they're a team that's showing a lot of potential, and you're just going to hope that they continue to show things like that and continue to grow as the split ends and as we move into the rest of the year. Then moving on to game number 4 here, a pretty interesting one? Not really all that interesting. It was GIANTX taking on G2 Esports, and G2 was able to pick up the win. 26 minutes, not particularly close. The score was close, and there were moments where GX was like, oh, you know, Patrick and Jackie's are getting gold, and Peach is moving around the map. He's trying to do things, but at the end of the day, like, did it ever really feel like they were going to win this game? Like, yes, they were able to win in lane, but hasn't everybody beaten G2 in lane over the course of this split? Isn't that just kind of what has happened? And then slowly over the course of the game, G2 ends up getting their lead back. They win one pivotal team fight in the back half of the game, and all of a sudden the game is over. That's G2. That's what they've done all split long, and I never really felt like anything was going to happen, you know, differently in this one. It always felt like it was inevitable for G2 to be able to come out on top in this one. Let's talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Caps in the mid lane on the, you know, attack speed LeBlanc. It feels like no matter what Riot does, no matter what Freak does in the balance team, this is unfixable. LeBlanc is always going to be played like this, even if she has literally 0 scaling in that department. It's really funny. Caps looked amazing in this game. Caps has looked amazing all split long. High likelihood he ends up being my split MVP. You know, a little bit of a spoiler there for the end of the video. But, you know, at least for now, Caps has been genuinely terrific for G2. This is one of the best splits he's had in quite a long time. Just being able to take over games, his team fighting has been immaculate. Even if his laning has been a little bit more up and down than it normally has, his ability to win games from behind is better than anybody I've seen at this level in quite a long time. Really impressive stuff coming in from him. I was tweeting out, again, a small plug. If you don't follow me on Twitter, what are you doing? Go follow me on Twitter. I'm even more unhinged on Twitter. I kind of just tweet out my thoughts while watching games, but I tweeted out during, I think the end of this week, that Yike and Caps are literally the only 2 good players on G2 right now. Everybody else is average and trolling, and without them, they would be a bottom tier team, but because they have these 2, they're a top tier team, and that includes Yike. Yike has been genuinely phenomenal over the course of this split. Now, the Maokai game wasn't exactly exceptional here, but he did do a lot of good setups in the back half of the game. I feel like it's a little bit disrespectful to Mickey to say that, because Mickey's been fine. You know, he's not really been bad. He's not been the Mickey X that he was in 2023. That's absolutely the case, but, you know, he's been fine. Hans has certainly been a problem, but for some reason, GIANTX decided, yeah, we can ban out Draven, but not the other one that he's good at in Callista. Don't really know why you would ban out one and not the other, but, you know, to each their own. And then Broken Blade actually had a pretty good game here. One of the better ones that he's played this split. I honestly don't think Broken Blade's been that bad. He just has not been all that impressive. And I think that's just generally the case for G2, is it really feels like these guys are whatever for most of the game. And then Caps and Yike play this team fight, Caps and Yike play a team fight really well, and then all of a sudden they win the game. That really does feel like the formula right now for G2. I don't know how sustainable that is, but at the very least right now it's working for the team. And then for GX on the other side, hey, I mean, you won some lanes against G2. That's got to be a pretty good feeling. Patrick and Jackie's, I think, generally looked okay. Patrick and Ignar, in particular in the bot lane, have definitely been the strength for GX. Patrick, I think, has actually had a quietly very good split. I don't think there's been a lot of AD carries that have actually been better than him, even with GX really struggling. It just doesn't really matter because the rest of the team ends up losing a lot more. Well, I guess just a lot more than Patrick does. Has a little bit of that Teddy syndrome in him where it's like, yeah, he doesn't really make a lot of mistakes, but does he really win games for his team? That's certainly something that I'm starting to consider with Patrick, but, you know, he had another good game here on the Xayah, was really good in laning phase against Hansama, actually was able to survive very well, but Jackie's ended up getting outplayed in that final team fight on the Azir, and dead of the game for me pretty easily is going to go to Otawamne in the top lane. He just did literally nothing in this game. He got beat by Broken Blade in the laning phase, went into these team fights and just kind of ran up and died trying to get on top of these these, very shifty backliners here of Kalista and LeBlanc for G2. And, Odo's not played well this split. It's really not like a hidden secret that Odo was not very good across all of winter up until this point. And I'm really not sure what to make of that. There were times last year where he wasn't looking good, specifically the spring split in the middle of the year. But even when Excel was in last place in winter and they were just unwinnable, like Odo was the rock on that team. And then when they got better in the summer split, I should say, he was actually pretty good for that team. It felt like there was a lot of reason to believe that Odo with a better team around him was going to continue to be one of the better top laners in the league. It just hasn't happened so far in the winter split. Certainly something to monitor. Really not a big fan of Peach, and generally I'm really not all that in on this GX team. I talked about it at the beginning of the year. They're just not all that interesting to me. Jackie's has been able to win some games with some clever team fighting in the back half of some games for GX, but outside of that, nobody on this team has really done much. Patrick is not making mistakes, but like I said, he's not really winning games. Ignar is not nearly as good as he was for Energy last year, which was predictable, and Peach and Odo Omne are just whatever on the top side of the map. GX feels like the most meh team in the LEC, and I think this was just another example of that, but for G2, I really do want to see them kind of break the strategy. I want to see them win an early game. This is kind of a team that's been known for doing well in lane the past couple of years. To see them kind of go to a more macro-oriented team fight style, it's definitely something. Like, it's good to know that they can do it, and Caps and Yike in particular, like I said, especially Caps, has been really good at that role this split, but, I want to see them actually start to play, the early games a lot better, because I think that's going to come back to bite them against maybe some of the better teams as we go throughout the LEC playoffs. Maybe it won't, maybe they're good enough, and maybe they'll turn it on, maybe they're just testing their luck right now, but at least for now, this G2 team doesn't feel like the overwhelming dominant team that maybe people were expecting at the start of the year. And then moving on to our fifth game of the first day, and this was a one that I think a lot of people were really looking forward to. It was a battle between the bottom teams. Can KC pick up their first win? It was K-Corp taking on Rogue. No, they cannot. Rogue is going to take the win here. They're going to move to 2-5, and K-Corp is going to move to 0-7 to start their LEC tenure. Certainly not what they were looking for. We already knew that. Nobody's surprised in saying that this is a disappointment of a start to the year, but honestly, what I do want to add to this conversation that maybe I haven't added enough is that it's really not the worst thing in the world for them to struggle in their first ever split in the LEC. It's really hard to make the transition up to the LEC, even as one of the most successful ERL teams of all time, if not the most successful ERL team of all time. Pretty clearly, I would argue. We've seen other organizations really struggle in year one. BDS is a prime example of that. I know obviously they were great in year two last year, and they've been really good at the start of year three this year, but year one was a disaster for them. People were calling them to be taken out of the league after that first year in 2022. And so, things can happen. You don't want to freak out about a team. It is very difficult to make that transition, but it is unfortunate that they are starting 0-7 and that they, at the moment, pretty clearly look like the worst team in the LEC. For Rogue's case, they were able to win a game. I mean, heck yeah. They beat G2, they beat K-Corp. Those are two good teams to beat in terms of popularity status. This team is not the most aggressive team in the world. They're still a little lackluster in terms of going out there and actually making plays, but their re-engages this game were really good. They did a very good job of capitalizing on K-Corp's mistakes, and I think generally this game was actually pretty positive for Rogue overall. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Larson in the mid lane. Corki has actually kind of stepped it up here in week number 3. I've been really underwhelmed by Corki in the West, both in the LEC and the LCS so far in 2024. Obviously, we've seen the power of that pick in something like the LCK, where those games just generally go a lot longer. But for someone like Larson, who is a bit more passive in the early game, who does want to scale up and just team fight in the late game, Corki is a pick that very much plays into his play style. And I think he definitely obviously had a lot of experience here. I think the thing I was not expecting was Corki getting so much lane prio in the mid game because of just how poorly Seiken was playing this Akali. We will get into that in a bit, but Larson, I think, did a great job of capitalizing on K-Corp's mistakes, whether it was Bo being way too far forward on the brand, whether it was Cabo just not playing well at all on the Cassante, or most notably, Seiken just not playing well at all on the Akali. I think Larson did a really good job of capitalizing on that. Larson's a good player. I think in a different situation, he would be generally fine. The player that I compare Larson to is Jensen in the LCS. I think they're very similar players, very similar skill sets, and I think he's, Larson's kind of going through the 2023 Jensen thing right now, where the team is just not built to be able to support him and play to his strengths, and it means that he looks a lot worse. When he still gets the opportunity to play his style and kind of do the things that he is good at, he's actually still really good at them, it turns out, but, it's just a little bit difficult when the rest of the team doesn't enable it well. Mark Hoon had a pretty good game here. Still have been really underwhelmed by him over the course of 2024. 2024. I really like Marcoon, but this has been the worst year of his career by far, at least at the start here. Obviously, I'm not saying that it's going to continue to be a problem, but him and Larson have anti-synergy in the jungle mid duo. Really nice to see him at least be able to out-jungle the Brand on the other side of this matchup. Shigenda, I thought, was a lot better in this game, but Cabo's been outplayed by basically everybody, and Comp and Zoalise were definitely there. Comp was fine, I guess, on the Senna. Really didn't have to do a whole ton, but this was Larson taking over in the back half of the game, mostly capitalizing on setups coming in from the top side of the map on Marcoon and Shigenda. So, you know, good for Rogue. At least they were able to win a game like this. Obviously, if they didn't, you would have been in complete panic mode. This would have been the worst team in the LEC, but they are not. They are at the very worst, the second worst team in the LEC, because they were able to take this win here. So for K-Corp on the other side, all the problems are just kind of coming to a head. This team honestly didn't look all that different in this game than they have at any point in this season. All of the same problems that they've had over the course of this year definitely reared their head here. Seiken not being able to survive in lane against basically any mid laner at this level. He's going to get my debt of the game. The Akali was awful early in the game. It was really awful in the mid game, and he did basically nothing in the team fight stage once the Corki was ahead and already had outscaled him. Bo, I think, has been a severely overrated member of this team. I've said that on this channel. I certainly think he's been the best player on this team. I mean, Upset's, I guess, in that conversation. I think Bo and Upset have had similar years, but it's not like Bo has really separated himself. Like, he's been a bottom half jungler in the league, and just because that makes him the best player on K-Corp doesn't mean that makes him a good player. He still makes some just egregious positioning mistakes in the mid game. Nobody does that more than Bo at the LEC level. Even in his good games, he'll have one or two moments where it's like, why are you there? Why are you giving gold over to the enemy team? What are you doing? Cabo Shard has been awful. I mean, he's made a case to be the worst player in the LEC this year. Really, the only player that's kind of contesting him for that has been Targamas in the support position, but Cabo, Seiken, Targamas, the three players coming up from K-Corp here, they just have not been able to survive at the LEC level. Obviously, you hope that they can get it together, and I would give them a bit more time to adjust to the LEC, but at least in this current state, like, they are clearly the weaknesses of this team. Upset had another game where he was fine. He didn't make any mistakes, but he also didn't really do anything on the Misfortune. He was relatively whatever in the early game, didn't capitalize on the lead that he should have gotten over the Senna nearly hard enough, and then by the time we hit the mid to late game, his team was outscaled to the point where he was completely useless as a champion, was never really going to be able to line up for a really good MF ult. You're really hoping that the Maokai ult lands. That's really the only way to set up Misfortune in this comp, and outside of that, Upset was essentially useless, but top side of the map was really bad in this game, and that's been a constant trend. There's really not a lot I can say about this version of KC. It's the same version that's been there over the first 2 weeks. It's a lot of really small mistakes and really bad late game macro, and that's just what it is, right? They just happen to fall apart a bit earlier in this game than they have in some others. They got outplayed by Rogue, and that is a very scary, sentence to say. I think it would take a miracle at this point for them to make top 8. I think it would take Rogue losing both of their final 2, as well as GX losing both of their final 2, and KC winning both of their final 2 to create some sort of tiebreaker scenario, but still, it's incredibly unlikely. If GX wins one game, KC is officially eliminated. If Rogue wins one game, KC is officially eliminated, and so you never want to be in that circumstance, but I guess it's technically possible still. We're sitting here saying that this is probably the worst team in the LEC, and it's sad to say that with all the hype surrounding them, but at least the fans are loyal. Seems like they're, at least primed for a bounce back in spring if this team can get something together. But for Rogue, nice win here. Your playoff hopes are not dead. I know that feels weird to say, but you have the same record as GIANTX after this game. If you go into the rest of this week and you're able to win one game, you're probably in a situation to at least get a tiebreaker, which is pretty nice for Rogue. Obviously, you're hoping the GX, can fall into a situation where they are actually able to just win towards the back half of the week, but Rogue has certainly made it interesting, and, this win is actually very important for them to keep their split alive. And now we get to move on to day number 2, our middle day here in the third and final week of the LEC Winter Split, and we kicked it off with a matchup between Team Vitality and Team Heretics. A couple of players here that have some business with each other, most notably the mid laners who were traded for each other in the offseason, and it's Vitality and VTO coming out on top in this one. Heretics continue to look pretty bad here in the final week. They did not look good on day number 1. They looked even worse here on day number 2 against a worse Vitality team, and I think it really is time to start being concerned. We'll talk about it. I've been a Perks defender, on this channel. I've been saying that a lot of the negative plays that people keep calling him out for, the inting, it's him feeling like he has to take on this big responsibility, going in and being super aggressive in 1v3s and just, trading 1 for 1 and not really being a positive to his team, but like trying his best at his worst, and at his best, obviously he's been a very good player. Multiple moments for Vitality over the past couple of years, but this Heretic split has really not been good. It's not even like, it's the lack of aggression, it's the scaredness, it's the lack of mechanics, it's getting outplayed, it's concerning details that I think have not been there for Perks over the last couple of years. But for Vitality, this was a good game. I'm not really sure how to take this because they were kind of gifted a lot of really good opportunities here. Hylissang tried his best to run it down on Renata, as he will tend to do on any champion he has the ability to do, but they gave VTO his signature champion. Of all the teams, Heretics should know that they shouldn't give him AP Kai'Sa in the mid lane. This is just what VTO plays at a super high level. He played it so much for Heretics. Last year when he was brought in summer, played it really well alongside Jankos and alongside Flacken, and here we are, him kind of destroying Perks on it. VTO is going to get player of the game. This is what I would consider to be his signature champion right now. I know we talk about assassins, things like the Akali and the Ahri, for VTO as kind of his signature picks, but to me, it's definitely Kai'Sa in the mid lane that stands out as something that he just will play no matter what the meta is, and he looks good on it. He's actually been very quietly very good this split. There have been some games, I should say, that have not been perfect. Like, he's not been amazing every single game after game after game, but especially in week 2, he was like very quietly very good for Vitality, and this is another really good game. He's had a couple of really big breakthrough games. I'm not going to say that he is the best mid laner in the league or anything, but I think we're starting to get the good version of VTO back. I think the confidence is definitely starting to return, and I think for the most part, he's given a lot more good than he has bad over the course of this split. Also want to give a big shout out to Karzi. He's had a really good, week 3 here. He was miserable in week number 1. That was really something that I was concerned about, was like, Karzi coming back to Vitality. He tends to fluctuate between being good and bad and good and bad. This felt like one of those bad moments, at least at the start of the year, but week 3 has definitely been a lot better for him so far. In both of the series that he's played, or both of the games that he's played here, he's actually been relatively good. The Varus here was very nice. Even with Hylissang kind of inting in a lot of different moments on the Renata, he was still able to capitalize on whatever he was able to create. Photon is very good on the top side. This was one of his weaker games of the split, which should just tell you how good Photon has been. And Douglas is there. I think the Rel was fine. Some of the engages were good. Some of the engages were bad, but mostly it was VTO and Karzi, I think, really creating a lot of the good for Vitality in this one. But for Heretics, like I said, you are starting to get concerned about Perks. Now, like I said in day number 1, he's pretty notorious for being awful in the last week of the season. It's just kind of something Perks has always done. I don't really know why he ends up doing that, but, folding down the stretch is definitely kind of a Perks, memento. It shouldn't cost them a playoff spot, but here it's certainly costing me a lot of confidence in this team. He's going to get dead of the game again. This was a bad Akali performance. The mechanics were super off, and I think that's the most concerning thing, is typically, like I talked about, when you had problems with Perks in previous years, it was that he was trying too hard. He was using too many mechanics to try to make plays that just weren't optimal plays. He was going in 1v3, trying to trade for one, and ending up, costing his team a lot of resources. But, at his best, he was outplaying his opponents in the mid lane. He was constantly leading mid laners in every single statistic, and now that version of him does not seem like it is translated to Heretics. He's been very bad mechanically and individually, which is just not the Perks that we've seen over the last 2 years. I know there have been people that have jumped off the bandwagon a lot quicker than I have on Perks. I've been defending him over the past 2 years because the mechanics and the individual performances absolutely have been there. It's just been some late game mental lapses that he needed to clean up, but the beginning of the game has really been a problem for him. This split, I think he's really not been very good for this Heretics team. One of the more, I guess, bad mid laners in the league, if we're being entirely honest. That has to change going into more important games down the stretch here, but Jankos, I thought, played really well. I think he honestly is going to get a bit too much credit for this Lee Sin performance. There were some really good moments coming in from the lead to try to get some leads, to try to keep this game going. He was able to get Kalista a lot of gold in the bot lane, but, generally, I think there were also some bad engages coming from him in the back half of the game. It really shouldn't have been his responsibility, but again, I think Jankos gets praised a little too much. Flacken and Kaiser were good. Kaiser's very quietly been very good for this team, but it just didn't matter here on the Hui. He didn't have anybody to enable, and then Wunder was actually, again, also pretty good on the top side. I think generally Heretics actually had a lot of good things going for them here. Perks just wasn't good enough for you to be able to win this game. That really was the end of the story. If you had a strong Akali here, this game is really, really winnable, and it just wasn't the case. I'm a bit concerned about Perks going into a phase of the game or a phase of the season where he really needs to step up. If Heretics actually does want to be a team that can contend at the top of the standings, like, Perks has to be better than this. Right now, he's a bit of an albatross for them. And then for Vitality on the other side, I think this team is better than maybe people are giving them credit for. A lot of their wins are very scrappy. They're very not clean, and this was definitely one of them. This was not a very clean win, but at the end of the day, wins are wins, and this team gets more wins than I think people expect them to. I think there is talent on this team. I think the solo laners are very good. If Karzi and Hilly are playing well, I think you can win games against teams that are better than you. Case in point, this game. And so, I'm interested to see what happens with Vitality. I'm not anointing them a top 5 team or anything like that, but I think they're a lot closer to that sphere than people give them credit for. Then moving on to our second game of day 2 here, and top team versus the bottom team goes pretty much exactly how you would think. It's Team BDS taking on Rogue, and BDS is going to pick up their 7th win of the split. They are 1 win away from guaranteeing themselves the number 1 seed going into the playoffs, which is pretty good. Obviously, top 2 is most important, but number 1 is still really solid. It means you get an easier side of the bracket, which I'm sure you're always looking for, but, Rogue also looking for a chance to potentially push themselves into the bracket. They're a team that I think a lot of people have written off as being a bottom 2 team, but they're very much still in the race depending on what happens with GIANTX, and so this loss does matter to them, but I gotta be honest with you guys, this game was so boring. There was a pause, and then it came back, and it felt like we were still paused because no one was doing anything, and this entire game was so boring, and that's just kind of how Rogue plays the game. Again, I've been comparing them to 2023 Dignitas all year long. I think they're a very similar team. I've compared Larson to Jensen on a lot of different occasions, and honestly, I've been trying to find the words to describe what Marcoon is as a player for like a year now, and especially because there are so many people that just see the version of him that is now on Rogue and haven't seen how he played for SK or Excel in the past, and I was wondering why I was really what I wanted to get across, why I wanted to defend him, and what kind of player I wanted to kind of translate him as. Really, I think I finally figured it out that Larson is Jensen and Marcoon is Santorin. I mean, they're basically the same player, but we'll get into that in a second. For BDS, I mean, nice, you got the win. Super happy for you. Again, you're 7-1. You're 1 win away from guaranteeing that first seed. It's a nice win. You've qualified for the playoffs long before this week even started, and so you're not super worried about that, but at least you were able to come out here and win this. It really was just a BDS team that did not look all that motivated, that didn't really look like they were trying all that much, beating a team that was trying even less than they were, so credit to BDS, I guess. Player of the game is going to go to Adam, because at the very least, the Garen was super annoying. God's champion, it's going to happen. They banned out the Olaf and the Darius, but you can't ban out Adam. There's just too many champions for him to go ahead and pick up, especially in a matchup against something like Cassante. He's going to be able to make use of that, because if you don't pick up the Cassante, he's going to pilot it really well. He can still play a lot of the other top laners, like the Gwen, at a pretty high level in that same vein. It's impossible to ban out Adam, and he continues to be amazing. He just beats everybody that he goes up against in lane. Really impressive stuff. Again, I know it's one of his signature champs, but if he's allowed to play it, if you're not going to ban it out from him, then it doesn't really count as something that he can't play. And he's already proven that he can play things outside of the Gods champions. I thought Nuke was really good here as well. The Orianna is a really good champion for him, and Larson, while he had a lot of gold, he certainly wasn't doing anything with it down the stretch, and Nuke was definitely a lot more impactful. I think you could realistically give him player of the game as well, and I certainly wouldn't bat too much of an eye. I thought Adam was more noticeable in terms of the role that he had, but maybe Nuke played a more consistent game from start to finish, was certainly a lot more safe in the mid game, which is fine. Sheo was whatever. I would have loved to see him be a lot more aggressive on the Xin Zhao going into a team that is notable for it being super passive in Rogue, but whatever, if he wanted to play the long con and make sure we got to the late game where Garen and Orianna could win a team fight and start taking over, then that was the game plan. I'm not going to sit here and try and criticize that too much. Ice and Labrov were there. Labrov has been an MVP caliber player for a lot of this split, but, the Alistar was just kind of there, and Ice got to play Ashe and just kind of sit in the back line and allow, again, Garen and Orianna to do all the work in the team fight. So, generally, good for BDS. Not really the most exciting of wins, but it's a win nonetheless, and it puts them in a pretty good spot. And then for Rogue, this team is just bad. There really is no other way to put it. I'm glad they were able to beat K-Corp. They did show kind of a different speed to them in that game, which was a good thing, but this is 2023 Dignitas. This is the slowest team in the world at the current moment. They have really nobody that's going to go out there and make impactful plays, and they're slowly going to bleed out and lose a lot of these games. Dud of the game is going to go to Marcoon for me. I think there are some people who are going to want to see me give this to Larson in the mid lane. At the very least, Larson was able to get a lead on Corki, even if he did literally nothing with it in the back half of the game. The part of the game that Larson has always been pretty good at. He was really bad at it here, but Marcoon was bad the entirety of the game. Jarvan wasn't creating anything. He wasn't, engaging. He wasn't fighting for objectives. He wasn't trying to, set up wombo combos with the Cassante or the Corki bombs. I don't really know what the Jarvan was for here. And like I said, it really does feel like the idea behind it has all come together for me. I've been really trying to figure out a player that I could compare Marcoon to that would make a lot more sense in terms of, explaining why he's not doing so well on this roster. And Santorin, I think, is really the perfect player to compare him to. I'm not really sure why I didn't think of this before. They're very similar skill sets. Both are very giving junglers, players that do like to enable their teammates, and both of them are much more known for their team fighting and their late game macro rather than their early game aggression, and that was Santorin's downfall on Dignitas last year. It's Marcoon's downfall on Rogue right now. Do I think Marcoon could still be a good player in the right setup? Absolutely. This is just very much not the right setup for a player like Marcoon to do a lot here. Zoe continues to be the only player who tries to make plays. The Blitzcrank was at least going for hooks in this game. They took away the blitz from LeBron, and Zoe I thought was interesting. Comp I thought was relatively fine. One of the more complete games that he's played all year long, which is crazy to say because he did basically nothing. And Shigenda just quietly lost to Adam on the top side, which again is better than what he's been for most of this year, but Rogue is so boring, so passive, they do nothing. And mid jungle has no synergy. This is a bad team, and they're really costing themselves some playoff spots with this loss. I mean, they're in a bad spot here. And then for BDS on the other side, a win's a win, but you're certainly not going to walk away feeling better about this team now than you did before. They're a good team. They beat a bad team. You're not surprised, but maybe you would have wanted to see it be a little bit more convincing before you really felt like it was, the BDS performance that they've lived up to. Now we get to move on to game number 3 here on day 2, and it is the match of the week in the LEC in the final week of the season. The big rivalry in the LEC, Fnatic taking on G2. Always fun when these two teams go head-to-head, and this one was no exception. Coming off of a super boring game, this was an amazingly fun game that G2 is going to walk away with a win in. Fnatic looking a lot better in this game than they have in a lot of their recent games, but, G2, I think, continuing to show that it's kind of a two-man race right now for this team. It's Yike, it's Caps. They're playing out of their minds. They're setting so much up for the rest of this team, and you're just hoping that that's good enough to get you across the finish line. So far, it has been because they have been that good, but the rest of this team is going to have to step up sometime. Hans, I think, was definitely better in this game than he has been recently. The big, pentakill at the end of the game certainly helps his scoreline look a lot better, but a lot of that was set up by the rest of the team, especially Caps. Generally, just G2 looking like a two-headed monster right now, and if that becomes a 3 or 4 or a 5-headed monster, it becomes a lot easier. But Fnatic looked much better in this loss than they did on their loss on day number 1 of this week. Significantly better here against G2. If it weren't for the fact that this team clearly has no idea what to do in the late game macro-wise, I actually do think that they would be a pretty good and scary team in this league. The problem is they have no idea how to close games or how to play team fights or where to be in the late game, and it's got to be frustrating for Fnatic fans. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, no-brainer. This one's going to Caps once again. This is how you play Akali. We've been seeing some pretty bad Akali games in the LEC, not only this week, but all year long. Generally, I didn't think Akali was all that good of a pick until I started watching the LPL, and I was like, oh wait, this is how you're supposed to play this champion. Clearly, I have been misguided, but Caps makes it look ridiculously busted in this game. He's everywhere on the map, constantly on the backline, perfectly, starting each fight at the right time. He just has such a good idea for when to be the aggressor in certain situations. An amazing player, likely MVP, for all the people who said that Caps wasn't his old self, his 2018, 2019, 2020 self. You can make the argument that that's maybe still true, but I don't know. This is a pretty damn good start to the year for a player that we were really looking to see re-break out as the definitive best player in Europe. I think he kind of has that title once again right now because he is just playing out of his mind. I do also want to give a ridiculous shout out to Yike in the jungle. I know I hype him up a lot on this channel, but he really is that good. It's not the situation. It is not the surrounding core. Yike is just that dude. The Xin Zhao this game was incredible, really important for a lot of the engages and a lot of the follow-ups on the Akali that Caps was making. Without these two, they do not win this game, period. End of story. If Yike and Caps are not both playing at such a high level in this game, they are just not going to win. So great stuff coming in from the jungle mid duo that's arguably been the best in the West to start the year. The synergy that these guys have shown has actually been ridiculous. Like I said, Hans was probably a better version of himself in this game. That pentakill in the back half, or I guess basically to end the game, was very big to make this scoreline look a lot better, but generally I thought his positioning was actually pretty good, was never really giving over big plays, was actively contributing in fights, which is something that isn't always, a big priority for Hans. I think staying safe in the late game has kind of been a priority for him, so it's nice to see him positioning a tad bit more aggressively, knowing that he can get some of that range advantage into Lucian. I think it ended up working out for him, but the other two members of this team, not so much. Broken Blade on the Vladimir, he was fine, I guess. He was probably more impactful than Oscarinin, but the Vlad didn't really do anything, just kind of survived in a side lane and eventually was just kind of there. And then my dud of the game is actually going to stay on G2. It's going to go to Mickey X. This was bad. This was almost a game-throwing performance from the Nautilus here. You can say what you want about, sometimes it looks like an int if you go in on Nautilus and, things don't go right, but those hooks were bad. Those hooks were attempted game-throwing from Mickey, and he just hasn't been that guy that he was last year. He was pretty clearly the best player in Europe in 2023. I don't think there's really a lot of people that are going to argue that. It has certainly not been that at the start of winter. He's not been awful, like I said. There really haven't been a lot of performances where it's been like, you need to chill out, dude. You need to calm down, but This was one of them. I think this might be the worst performance he's given over the course of this year. He almost single-handedly lost his team this game, so hopefully he can figure some stuff out. Like, he's been pretty inconsistent over the course of his career, more so than people give him credit for. I got a lot of hate for, just kind of saying how bad his year on Excel was, or half a year on Excel was, and that's a version of Mickey X that does exist. I'm not saying that that's the version you're going to get all year, but it really hasn't been all that good in Winter so far. Yike and Caps have really been the core of this G2 team, and I think we once again saw that in this game. And then for Fnatic on the other side, they put up a good effort. I think this was probably their most complete showing as a team, which is really funny to say because they lost and they really threw it away in the late game. But I think in terms of nobody really feeling like a weak link, this was the performance for that. It was one of Humanoid's worst performance of the year. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. He was still relevant in this game. Corky bombs were still doing a lot of damage. He's just been really good to start the year, and so when you see him just kind of be whatever in this game, Noah and June were actually very consequential. Noah in particular, June really just dropping the range extender on him. June didn't really do anything else outside of that. His positioning was pretty bad, but you know what? Milio's very viable, so I can't take away from the fact that Milio made this game easier for Lucian to play, but Noah, I thought, played better than he had been recently. Razork, I thought, was relatively okay. Oscar continues to struggle on the top side, especially without the Cassante. I know Jax is kind of like a signature pick for Oscar Renin, but he's not particularly good at it, or at least he's not been playing like he's good at it right now. The problem with Fnatic, and the reason that this team ended up falling in this game, is they just have no idea what to do in the late game. This is like the third or the fourth game this split where it's just been like, okay, you're in a decent position, you have a comp that should be able to win a lot of fights towards the back half of the game. All you have to do is be in the right place at the right time and not overextend, not put yourself in a bad position, not take a fight with low numbers, and every single time it feels like Fnatic fails that check. If they can just clean up and shore up some of the mistakes, the weird, costly mistakes that they're making in the back half of these games, this could be one of the best teams in the LEC. As it stands right now, I am concerned about what's going to happen when they face, great teams over and over again in a best of 3, in a best of 5. Are they going to be able to overcome those teams? I don't know, because the late game of this team is so inconsistent, even if the talent level of this team is pretty high. It's crazy to say, but Razork and Humanoid playing some of the better regular seasons that they have in recent memory, honestly, doesn't mean much right now if this team doesn't figure out what they want to do in the mid to late game. I have a feeling they're going to figure it out. This is a team and an org that almost always gets better as we get into best of series and not best of 1s, best of 3s, best of 5s, etc. So you have to hope that that trend is going to continue once they get into playoffs here, but it is a very notable concern, even if this game was a lot better than their day 1 one. And then G2, they're very, very good. The problem is I need to see them be better than good. A team like BDS right now is really pushing them for that number 1 spot in the LEC. G2's not out of that number 1 seed by any means. If BDS loses their game on the final day and G2 can end with a 3-0 week, they can still get the number 1 seed in the regular season, which obviously would be ideal for them, but I really need to see this bot lane start stepping up. I need to see top lane start stepping up. Yike and Caps have done their job. It's time for everybody else to uphold their end of the weight. And now moving on to our 4th game of day number 2, and a very important one in terms of the playoff sweepstakes that we've got going on. It's Mad Lions taking on GIANTX, and GX is going to pick up their 3rd win of the split. This is a pretty big deal because it does guarantee them, at the very least, a tiebreaker for that last playoff spot. We were talking about how it was, open-ended, that there was a possibility that a team like Rogue could sneak in if GX continued to really struggle. Now, if Rogue ends up winning out, if they win tomorrow, these two teams play each other. If Rogue can beat GX, that should force a tiebreaker between the two, which means that GX isn't guaranteed for anything, but this win at least puts them in the position where they can lose 1 game tomorrow and still be in a spot to make playoffs. So nice win from them. Mad Lions cooked a little bit too much in the kitchen here. They went for a pretty big Wombo comp, and they really wanted to try and make that work. Merwin going for what I think a lot of people who know him from, his ERL days and from his solo queue days would consider his signature top lane pick here in the Fiddlesticks. Didn't quite work out in the way that maybe you would want it to, but, you got to give bonus points and brownie points for trying here. Let's start with GX, though. Player of the game for me, pretty up in the air because there were 2 players that were awesome here. I'm going to give it to Peach in the jungle on the Xin Zhao. This champion continues to look really, really good in the LEC. This is a region that really does value snowballing, and it values early game aggression, and I think Xin Zhao just does what LEC teams want out of a jungler really well. He's able to skirmish a lot early on. He's not afraid to call for help and try to go for these 2v2s around Scuttle Crab, even at level 3, if you want to try to make that work. Alternatively, he can gank very quickly, into games. He has very, very good gank assist, and, he deals a lot of damage, but also he has good objective control. Maybe he's not the most consistent of team fighters, but he gives you a really nice ultimate and gives you time in fights to allow your carries to be able to play a little bit more aggressive. He just just kind of gives you a bit of everything that you could want out of a jungler, specifically here in the LEC for how they like to play games. And I think Peach does execute on that really well here, especially going into something like Nocturne. You want to be able to generate that lead pre-6 pretty heavily so that by the time Nocturne is out on the map in this comp that's really designed to be this massive wombo of you turn off the lights, you get Nico to go in, and you have Fiddlesticks ulting on top of that. Like, I understand the idea behind this, but the problem is that if you don't get that, like, especially before that, if you're not at that point, it's really hard to imagine these picks and these champions actually doing a whole ton in this game, and I think Peach did a really good job of suppressing that for as long as possible, getting himself and his team a pretty considerable lead, most of it going to the Nilah in the bot lane, which is a very good idea here, and, you know, basically just snowballing the game out of control. But I do want to give a lot of props to Ignar in the support position as well. Been talking a bit about how I wish NRG Ignar was kind of back in this lineup, in this roster. I wish that the version of him that we saw when he got confident with FBI last year was here on GX, because I think that that's kind of what they're missing, is that primary engage threat, somebody that you can look at as a big playmaker for the team, and he was that on Alistar in this game. This was a much, much better performance than what we've seen from him for most of the year so far, so really happy to see that. Peach and Ignar, two players that really need to step up for this team, stepping up. Odoamne was a lot better getting to play Rumble. He's a lot more comfortable on these AP carry threats. Hasn't been super consistent on them this year, but it's nice to see that he can still play them when he needs to, although shout out to Merwin, we'll get to him in a second. Jackies and Patrick were definitely along for the ride, and they capitalized on a lot of the things that both Peach and Ignar were creating, but generally it was definitely the creators and the playmakers that were more of the spotlight here than the carries. And then for MDK on the other side, you know, when you go in the kitchen to cook, sometimes it comes out a little bit burnt, and that's just unfortunately what happened here. Again, I want to reiterate, I get the idea of the comp in my head of, like, if you turn out the lights and you get that big Nico ultimate, if Fiddlesticks is anywhere in the area, then you can combo that in, or alternatively, yeah, you can set up for a really nice Fiddle ultimate and then combo that with Nico since it's a little bit quicker, but whatever you want to do here, if you don't land that combo, these champions become significantly weaker isolated, and I think that's kind of what we saw here. Merwin was actually pretty good. He was making a couple plays, moving around, making plays bot lane, which was super interesting on the Fiddlesticks. We know he plays this champion top lane, you know, frequently. This is something that's kind of been a cult classic for him for a little while, but unfortunately, the rest of the team just couldn't hold up. Jungle mid was outclassed in this one. Peach did a much better job than Elgoya at generating that early pressure, and GX really never gave that up. And then dud of the game for me is going to go to Supa in the bot lane. Really hate his build on Kai'Sa, went full on hit in this game. I just don't think that's the idea into Nilah, LeBlanc, and Xin Zhao, and, you know, all of these really mobile targets. I think it's very difficult for her to actually be super useful in this particular instance, not to mention I think Supa's positioning was just a little bit too aggressive in this game. When you're playing from behind, usually I will, you know, encourage you to try to make some more aggressive plays to get yourself back into the game, but you, as Kai'Sa, you really need to make sure that you take those opportunities when they're available and not just every single time they're up. I think Supa could have been a little bit better in this game in terms of that. I generally like him a lot. I still think he's been very good over the course of this split, but this is probably one of his worst games of the split up until this point. I'm not worried about Mad. You know, 500 team, this team's going to have their ups and downs. They're going to have their bumps and their successes. This was just a bump, but this is a huge win for GX. I mean, again, guaranteeing themselves at the very least a tiebreaker depending on what happens in their game against Rogue on the final day. That's really good for them. This team wants to make top 8. I think they have a pretty good shot to do that, especially if they play like how they did in this game across the rest of this season. And now moving on to our 5th and final game of day 2 here, the middle of the week, and I know you all have been waiting to hear me talk about it. SK Gaming versus K-Corp. They did it. They won a game, everybody. K-Corp is able to pick up their first win in the LEC over SK Gaming. Congratulations to K-Corp. This has to feel like a gigantic weight off their back. I can't imagine the relief of walking off that stage knowing that that feeling has finally been conquered, that immovable obstacle in front of you is finally at least been shoved to the side. They're eliminated from the playoff contention with GX's win because they can't get 3 wins. It's impossible. They've only got 2 games left, and, you know, 2 wins is at maximum what they'll be able to get, but they're still building. They are building something. You know, it's only the first split. You've still got spring. You've still got summer. This team isn't down and out forever. We've seen teams go from 10th to potentially close to Worlds last year. We saw Excel go 10th, and then be literally 1 game away from going to Worlds by the end of the year. So it definitely is possible. KC building some momentum and some confidence here for SK. It sucks to be the team that does eventually lose to K-Corp, but it had to be someone. one, and it actually makes a lot of sense for it to be SK, a team that pretty notoriously does not live up to its billing when it's put in high-pressure situations. And so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game. Come on, man. It's Bo. This was a Bo experience coming in on the Xin Zhao. I talked in the previous section about how I thought Xin Zhao was such a good pick generally for the LEC. Bo has certainly not been a stranger to that champion over the course of this split, but they finally put trust in him, and they finally just, like, gave up their lane to play for him. I wouldn't normally say that's a good idea. Bo is a very feast or famine player, and generally you don't want to put all your eggs in the Bo basket. Ask Vitality last year how well that worked out, but I don't know, man. At least try it this year, and they try it, and it ends up really working out. A lot of people would consider Bo the best player on this team this year. I probably would agree. Especially after this game, I certainly would agree. I think especially Cabo, Seiken, and Targamas have really struggled. Upset really hasn't been given a chance. Not that I think he's been good, but rather I really don't think he's been able to show anything over the course of this split, at least in a large sample size. And so Bo has really been the one player that I think has been trying. Like I said, he hasn't been perfect. There's been some games where he just will, I mean, basically every game he'll just die randomly in River at like 15 minutes for no reason and give a bunch of gold to the enemy team. But if he can make it worthwhile that all the other plays are bigger than that play, then it's worth it. And that's what we kind of saw here. This was much more of a glimpse into like the winter split Bo from last year, where he really was just dominating people early on in games, being able to snowball it out of control. Really happy to see him honestly be a really good player for this team, an interesting player. I'm certain that they're going to build around him. I think another very big thing for me to see, Cabo Shard won, and that is not normal. Like, he has not done that over the course of this split. He has kind of been bodied by every top laner that he's played against, but, you know, Irrelevant, a player that continues to get a lot of hype, a player that I've cautioned people on overhyping. Irrelevant got smashed in this game, like truly smashed. He played Aatrox into Rumble, which is obviously not a great matchup, but you know, you picked it. Like, you picked Aatrox. You got to be willing to play that. If Rumble's up, you got to be willing to play that matchup, and Irrelevant just got smashed in it. Credit to Cabo Shard for keeping his mental. Talk about a player who's been through a lot. It's really nice to see him actually have a good game here. Seiken was actually really clean in this game on the Nico. He dodged, I think it was maybe a Varus ultimate. I think it was Varus ultimate with a really cool interaction where he, as Nico, changed into Rakan. Very cool stuff. You know, you're not going to see a lot of players have the wherewithal to do that, but, you know, those are the kinds of mechanics that got Seiken a lot of praise in the ERLs. Really glad to see him do something here, even if he wasn't like a primary focus. He was a nice setup, and those Nico ultimates are big. I think they were very important. Upset was fine, Targamas was fine, but generally this was the top side of the map. It was Bo and Cabo taking over in terms of damage. Seiken with some really nice setups, and K-Corp picking up their first win by trusting their feast or famine, very high variance jungler, and that's kind of what you could have hoped for this team towards the back half of the split. Why not, right? And then for SK, obviously it sucks to be the team that gives K-Corp their first win. You don't want to be the one to fall first, but you got outplayed here. There really is no other way to say it. Niski looked really good on the Corki, was actually able to do a lot. Seiken's laning phase is miserable. Even on good laning champions, he just very rarely generates any sort of pressure, and so Niski was really just allowed to get this lead, allowed to get this gold lead and move around the map, and he actually got quite a bit of lead from fights as well, from skirmishes in the mid game, but it was everybody else on the map that lost, especially this top side. Dead of the game is going to go to Irrelevant. This is the kind of performance that's a little bit more familiar to people who have watched Irrelevant. You see a lot of people talking about how he's like guaranteed top 1, top 2, top laner in the LEC. This is more so what he has been the last couple of years, which is a player who, you know, a couple of games he looks dominant. He goes up against, you know, Oscar Rinnan and looks like a world beater, right? He goes up against, you know, some of the more bottom tier top laners and looks like a world beater, but it's not always the most consistent thing in the world. He'll have games where he's bad, and that's kind of what has always kept him out of that upper echelon for me, and this is just not a performance that you can put down if you want to consider yourself one of the best top laners in the league. The best top laners don't have performances like this. I mean, I've criticized Broken Blade so much over the course of this split for not being useful to G2, and this is worse than any game he has played, so certainly something to keep in mind. I thought Isma also had probably his worst game of the split here going into Bo. Bo was just so active and aggressive on the map, and for the first time, Casey actually put a lot of resources into making that a viable strategy to win the game. Isma really didn't have an answer to that. They've really not faced a team that wanted to put so much time and effort into getting that jungle matchup ahead, and Isma was kind of hoping, I think, that one of his lanes would bail him out, and they just weren't able to do that. Cabo was ahead. Even though Niski was ahead, he was Corky, and he really had no peel, so there wasn't anything to do, and bot lane was essentially useless this game. Generally, SK just didn't play particularly well, and this is what I'm talking about. SK is a team that has reservations for a reason. Do I think that this team is interesting or can make noise in the playoffs? I think it's definitely possible, but I certainly don't think it's a guarantee that this is a top 4 team coming out of the regular season, which is why I've had them at number 5 after week number 2. It's certainly going to be interesting to see what they do on the final day, but this was not a loss that I think they wanted to get. For K-Corp, obviously, this is a massive win. Doesn't really matter in the scheme of like this particular split because they're out of the playoffs and everything, but again, to build that confidence, to get that trust, it's really nice to know that this collection of players can play well enough to outplay one of the teams that's kind of been doing really well to start this year. And that is going to bring us to our third and final day of action here in week 3 and in the winter split regular season here already. And we get to kick off day number 3, the final day here, with probably the most important game of the day, at least in terms of playoff implications. GIANTX taking on Rogue. And GIANTX is going to pick up the win. If Rogue had won this game, these two would have the same record. They would be tied for 8th place, and they would play a tiebreaker at the end of the day, as it is now with GIANTX being able to pick up their 4th win, dropping Rogue to 2-7. That means our 8 playoff teams are confirmed. The order is not confirmed. There's a lot that can happen over the course of the day to give teams better or worse spots in terms of seeding in the playoffs, but we do know the 8 teams that officially make it in, and with this win, GX is one of them. They are the final team to make it into playoffs. Congratulations to them. I think this team does deserve it. They are better than Rogue. They were certainly better in this game, and you know, this is an okay team. As much as I rag on them, as much as I'm really not all in on what GX has been able to offer, I still think they're a pretty good team, one that definitely deserves to be in the top 8 and not in the bottom 2 at the very least from what they've shown so far this split. But for Rogue, they are absolutely a bottom 2 team. They deserve to be sitting there in the bottom 2 with how they played over the course of the winter split. You just have to hope that something can change moving into the next couple of splits, because this is the last game that they will be playing until the start of spring. But it is what it is. We'll talk about it in a minute, I should say. For GX on the winning side, player of the game is going to go to Odo Omne in the top lane. I've been talking about how Odo really hasn't been all that good this split. Well, now he's playing his former org, the one that got rid of him just after they won a championship. And you know what? He's going to be the one to officially kick them out of the playoffs here. It is very apropos, very poetic of him to do so, to have his really only good game of the entire split come to kick Rogue out of contention. Really funny that that ends up happening, but this was a great Gnar game. He was really good in lane. Shigenda has really struggled over the course of this split, and Odo very much took advantage of a more aggressive pick coming in from the top side, was able to generate a lot of pressure early, and then his team fighting is actually absurd when he is in like good confidence and when the team around him is, you know, able to enable the Gnar. He was doing a ton of damage on that champion. Ridiculous. Obviously, more of a frontliner in this comp in particular, but he really was kind of a carry in terms of what he was outputting. Just a generally kind of a classic Odo Omne game, if you really think about it. A lot of pressure going elsewhere on the map, and he was just able to generate his own lead in the top lane and then just kind of win the game for his team. Really nice stuff. Rest of the team was also great. Ignar with the 2nd game in a row where he looked really good. This is so important, I think, for GX. Obviously, it's a pretty big long shot for them to be, like, super competitive in the playoffs because they're going to be one of the lower seeds. They're going to have to play one of the better teams at the top of the LEC at the start of the group stage, but Ignar is, you know, a big piece towards GX being competitive. He was really good in the final 2 games of the season for this team on Alistair. This was a big pick for him down the stretch last year as well, when energy was really kind of streaking in the playoffs. A lot of Alistair, a lot of Tom Kench. That style of engage, he was zoning out like 3 people at a time from Baron Pit just on Alistair alone. Very impressive stuff. The presence, obviously the engages were really good, but Odo and Ignar, I thought were really the standout members. Peach continued to look really good here. He's actually been pretty solid down the stretch for this team, and Jackie's and Patrick were fine enough. Patrick really didn't have to do a whole ton on the Ashe, really just kind of got to be there. GX definitely deserved this win. Again, I don't really feel all that different about this team in the grand scheme of things, but it's nice that they're at least in the top 8. But for Rogue, like I said, last game that they're going to play in Winter Split, last game they will play until Spring Split. I don't know if changes are on the horizon for this team. I certainly would be considering it somewhat aggressive somewhere on the map, because this team just has no priority on winning early. None of their players are really inclined to be that resource-heavy, aggressive style. I don't know where you would change to go out and get that. You know, bot lane is certainly the first direction I would look in, perhaps top lane. I mean, jungle mid do not have any synergy together, but both of them are probably your 2 most talented players, even if they haven't been particularly good this split. I don't really know where you look, but at least in this particular game, dud of the game is going to go to Zoelise in the support position. I was really high on him. I was a little high on him, I should say, going into the year. I was really high on him after week number 1, where I was like, this team sucks, but Zoelise is actually pretty good. He was playing relatively well after the first week, but it feels like a lot of the negative effects of Rogue have definitely taken their toll on him as a player as well, because he was not very good during the second half. He was pretty bad in week 2, and he was pretty bad in week number 3. You just gotta hope that that was more of an outlier, an early career kind of thing. He still has to get used to the LEC, because the upside was kind of shown there in week number 1, but down the stretch, he was one of the worst supports in the LEC. Something definitely to monitor. Playing with Comp doesn't help. Comp has been a pretty useless AD carry at this level for the last 2 years, essentially, playing for Koi last year in Rogue. This year, Larson tried. Shigendo was doing damage on the Jace in the back half of the game, but he really was not nearly as good as Otoamne, not nearly as relevant, and Marcoon is just so passive on the Rel. I've never seen a Rel player just refuse to engage into 3 men as much as Marcoon does. It's just a problem with this team. The problem with them is always going to be mentality. Obviously, there are mechanical issues, but it's the decision-making, it's the way that they play the game, it's the fact that none of them want to take the reins. Something has to give, something has to change, because in their current state, this Rogue team is just not good enough to really be able to compete at any level, and I think they proved that over the last couple of weeks. But for GX, congrats to them for getting into the top 8. It's not going to get any easier from here, but you've guaranteed yourself that spot. No tiebreaker necessary. I still don't think they probably, win a series or anything in there, because I think it's pretty clear that they are the worst team of the top 8, but at the very least, being top 8 means that you're not bottom 2, and honestly, that's already an upgrade over what this organization was going through last year. And now moving on to game number 2, and it's a top of the table versus bottom of the table clash, and it's the LEC. You know exactly how these go. It's Team BDS taking on K-Corp, and K-Corp pick up their second win of the split, their second straight win here. BDS suffers only their second loss of the entire split. They've only lost to KC and G2. Those are the only 2 teams that they've lost to. They're the, I guess, anti-Rogue, if you will, with Rogue only having 2 wins over KC and G2. Now BDS sitting here with 2 losses. It's very funny how that ended up working out, but credit to K-Corp, man. The final 2 games of the season, once they had already been eliminated from playoffs, they go out there and they win. They're able to take down SK Gaming, one of the more interesting teams in the league, and then the team that had only lost 1 game the entire split, BDS, who looked unstoppable. Leading up to this game, they were able to take them down. Now, I know there's a lot of excitement surrounding the K-Corp community, and I'm certainly not going to be the one to try and temper those expectations or that excitement. There is truth to the fact that a lot of teams just take time to figure out how to play together, and that they absolutely did play a lot better this week. They had a clearer idea of, I think, what their playstyle wanted to be, playing around Bo, more so in the early game in the jungle, allowing Cabochard to just play super risky and just unleashing Bo, trying to outskill their opponents, like skill check in individual positions while allowing the rest of the team to play weak side. It's a good strategy. However, I also want to note, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't speak honestly with how I felt. We see this all the time. BDS had already locked themselves a playoff spot, and they had already locked themselves a top 2 seed. They were guaranteed to be the number 1 team in whatever side of the bracket that they were on at this point. Obviously, it's great to get the higher side of the bracket so that you can play, GX or whoever the number 8 team is in the playoffs, but you're really only playing at worst for like number 1 or number 2. There is a real chance that they weren't really trying as hard in this game, and, it is just 1 game, so great. I'm glad KC could win here, but I'm really not all that worried about BDS. This feels like a game that they could have very well mentally have just taken off and not worried too much about. But for KC to be so locked in, even when things were already grim, when things were already done, locked in, finalized, it's a very big positive for them overall. So let's talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Cabochard in the top lane. How he got away with how he played in this game is beyond me. If Sheo had any sort of pressure or literally any sort of mindset to go top lane at any point in this game, the Olaf was dead 50 times over, but never got punished for anything he did before 10 minutes and ended up being super influential on the output of this game. He shut Adam down really early on into this matchup. Adam did a great job of being able to come back and actually be able to survive and be useful in some of these fights later, but Cabo was so far ahead at that point that the Olaf really just started to take over the game. It wasn't just him, but he was definitely the most direct member of the team that was causing panic on the side of BDS. Bo continues to be a major PowerPoint of the map for KC. I really like how Bo is playing at the current moment. This is a different version of him than we've seen the first couple of weeks, and honestly, this is still different than what we saw out of Vitality. This feels like a nice mix of what we were asking for. There were times where he would not get any sort of resources from his team, and he would kind of fade into the background because they were scared of investing into him last year on Vitality, and obviously last year there were times where they let him loose and he would go for 10 kills and 10 deaths and he would lose the game for his team. It happens, that's what Bo is, but it feels like a nicer middle ground here. I'm still frustrated with the amount of like 15 to 20 minute lapses in judgment that he made. Like there's one play every game where it's like, why are you there? What are you doing? And the top junglers just don't make those plays, but you know, he's been pretty good over the course of this split, and especially down the stretch, he was definitely better than he had been at any point before that. So nice to see that, especially nice to see Cabochard actually finish off the year pretty strong. Targamas had the best game of the split by far that he has had, and it wasn't even close. Targamas was one of the easiest people to look at and say, well, that's a candidate for a replacement. There are a lot of really good supports out there. Maybe someone like Trimby is only a phone call away from pairing up with someone like Upset, and all of a sudden this conversation becomes a lot more different. You have a clear shot caller, you have somebody with a lot of experience, but Targamas played phenomenal in this final game. It's definitely more of an interesting conversation now. This Bard game was really good. Bardgamas is definitely something that he's played a lot in the past. Think back to the G2 days. He was actually playing this champion quite a bit back in the day. It's certainly something that I would consider a big part of his resume. It certainly makes the conversation more interesting, but you know, I'm not here to tell you what they're going to do in between splits. I'm here to tell you that Targamas was really good here for this team. Seiken, you know, again, very passive, doesn't really seem to have a ton of confidence at this level, but still was able to step up and deal damage when he was needed. Just not somebody that I think is very used to getting attention, at least at this level. And then Upset was also fine on the Kalista. Definitely won bot lane, but that was mostly due to Targamas. It was really the top side of the map, Cabo and Bo, that looked really good, and that's a great sign for KC. And then for BDS, again, like I said, I'm really not panicking at all from this. This is a pretty standard move for whoever is currently the #1 team in the standings in the LEC to lose to the team with one win. It just kind of happens. It just kind of is the way that it is here in this region. Some of the things to point out, if there is a weakness to BDS, if there is a way to capitalize on them right now, it probably is through the jungle. Sheo going to get done to the game here, and you know, this is their second loss of the year, and this is the second time that Sheo has kind of been exploited. He got exploited by G2 and by Yike as well. Very aggressive junglers can sometimes just outpace what Sheo wants to do. Now, I don't think Sheo's a bad jungler, but I think we're starting to see that maybe he's a little bit more average than the rest of this team is. Adam is not average. He's one of the best top laners in the league. He was put in a really awful situation here by Cabochard, and he still managed to be relevant in this game, which is great. LeBron was an MVP candidate, even if he wasn't great in this game. Ice is fine. He's very good as a weak side AD carry and somebody who is really good in late game team fights. And Nuke has been generally good, even if the Nico didn't necessarily show that here. But I think Sheo is somebody that you can look at and see a potential to capitalize on. I'm not saying that that is going to be what happens to this team or to Sheo throughout, you know, some major series, but it's certainly something to watch. Things become a lot more difficult when Sheo, you know, isn't playing well. And that happens more often, I would say, than anybody else on this team. So for BDS, again, not panicking. Sometimes you just lose the game early on. Sometimes Cabochard is allowed to get away with whatever the hell he did, and Bo has a lot of pressure in the early game, and the game just snowballs out of control. It's allowed to happen. I just don't want to see it happen, you know, continuously or regularly for this team. But for KC, again, great confidence builder. I don't know what this means for them moving forward. You would have thought that changes were definitely on the table before this win. You never really know what happens, but with a lot of the momentum that they were able to get, you know, in their last two games here, it's definitely more of a conversation now. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the spring, but I think this should give a lot of K-Corp fans hope that this team is going to do a lot better the next time they come out for next split. And then moving on to game number 3. This, you know, is the slot for game of the day typically, and you would think this would be the game of the day, but one of these teams is really just not stepping up. It's Fnatic taking on Team Heretics. And Fnatic is going to pick up the 5th win of the season for them. Heretics is going to fall to 4-5 after going into this week 4-2. And now things are really starting to look a little bit worrisome for Heretics. There's a chance that they get stuck with a bottom 2 seed, like a 7th seed going into the playoffs. And generally it's like, who cares? It's 7th seed, you know, what does that actually matter? Does it really change anything? Yeah, I mean, facing one of the top 2 teams is not really something that you want to do right now, even in a best of 3. Really not a situation that I think you want to be a part of. And so for Heretics, this week went about as poorly as it possibly could. There was a lot that went wrong here, but for Fnatic, they do get to right the ship here. They also went into the week 4-2, and so they get to stop the 0-3 from happening to them on the other side of this. They definitely played better in this game. They pretty much controlled it from moment 1, and I think there's a lot of reasons to feel good about Fnatic. Maybe not great, but good about Fnatic heading into the playoff stage. But player of the game for me here is once again going to go to Humanoid in the mid lane. I'm willing to say it. I don't know if this is going to be a controversial opinion, actually. Let me know whether you guys agree with this down in the comment section below. This 9-game stretch that Humanoid had in the regular season was the best that he has ever looked outside of the playoffs ever. Like in the history of his career. Splice, Mad Lions, Fnatic. Like any version of Humanoid for a 9-game stretch in the regular season has never looked as good as he did here. I'm willing to make that argument. Again, I don't really know what you guys think of that. Let me know down in the comment section below, but he's been awesome. He's truly been everything that he has been hyped up to be over the past couple of years. He's re-cemented himself near the top of the mid lane rankings, number 2 in my opinion, only behind Caps. I've been saying for so many years now that it was only going to take that one regular season, that one split, where everything just worked for me to immediately jump back on the humanoid train. Well, here it was. Here was everything I was asking for. He was great in this game on the Corki. He's been great all split long. Really manhandled Perks in this matchup. We'll talk about Perks, dude. I don't even know what to say in terms of him, but Humanoid continued to be great here. He was just phenomenal. Him and Razork have figured out whatever problems they've had for the past 2 years, and the patience that this organization has shown with that duo is definitely paying off now, because this is easily the best they have ever looked together, and that's not particularly close. There have been moments where they've looked good, but most of the time it's separately and not necessarily as a duo. It really does feel like they are a cohesive jungle mid duo at the current moment. Not something I've been able to say about Fnatic for the last 2 years. Really nice to see it here. Oscar was much better this game. Noah and June were much better this game, specifically June on the Blitzcrank, who was very active. Pretty easy to play Blitzcrank in this matchup, especially when the Azir's just going to let you hook him every time. But again, like, June played a lot better, I think, towards the back half of this week. I'm still not sold on this bot lane. Noah in particular is somebody who I just do not think has had a very good split, and I'm very concerned about whether or not he's going to be able to hold up when other teams actually pressure him in the early game. That being said, Humanoid and Razork are playing really well. If there is a way to win, it's going to be through them. Not to say anything negative, because playstyle-wise, I think these two teams are kind of different, but Fnatic does feel a bit like budget G2 right now, with a really good jungle mid, and you just kind of hope that everything else is good enough around them. But the problem is that Fnatic's late game macro is still a major question mark. It was never called into question in this game because of how ahead they were, but it's certainly something that we're going to continue to monitor. But for Heretics on the other side, I mean, about as disastrous of a final week of the season as you can get. Pretty normal stuff for Perks, I say in jest, because even this is pretty outlandish. Perks, somebody who has notoriously not performed well in the final week of any split. Like, this is worse than the Vitality collapse in 2022, in my opinion. Like, this is bad. Like, obviously it doesn't matter as much because he's still in the playoffs and things like that, but this was really, really bad from Perks. He's done of the game again. Game number 1 of this week, I'm like, yeah, he made that one mistake, but people are kind of, blowing it up. People are taking it a little bit too far. He was still pretty good for most of that game. He just made a pretty costly error that cost him the game. Whatever. Game number 2, certainly outclassed, but in a way where it was like, he wasn't super offensively bad. He just wasn't as good as the players around him. There's no excuse for this third game. I mean, he just got massacred. This is one of the weakest Azir performances I've ever seen. I mean, truly, no damage, no involvement, no pressure, no confidence, no laning, nothing. Absolutely nothing coming out from Perks. This is one of the worst games of the year from anybody in the LEC, and it's just crazy that it's happening to Perks. He has been really bad this split. Again, I'm a Perks defender, but I'm also not afraid to admit when I'm wrong. Anybody who watches the channel knows that. I just said the same thing in my LPL review, like 2 days ago now, but I'm not afraid to sit here and say, like, my opinion has changed, and clearly this player is not who I thought they were. Perks was awful in winter, and he was especially bad this week. He really had moments where he was doing okay, week 1, week 2, he was able to survive. He wasn't a focal point for the team, but generally when they won, he would win. He was an albatross in this final week, and that simply has to change. They're not going to get out of the group stage if this is what he looks like when they get to that group stage. But worth noting that GIANTX was also really bad in this game. I mean, lost control super early to Razork and just was giving free kills over to Humanoid by the end of the game, going for plays that just were never going to work. You can see that he was trying to make something happen, but it was in a bad way where he was overextending in situations he just didn't need to be so pushed up for. Kaiser, I think, had one of his worst games in a while. Flackhead just didn't do anything on the Varus, and Wunder definitely tried to win this game against his former organization and the player that did end up replacing him, but only so much you can do on tank Udyr in the top lane when you have no damage across the rest of your team. And so, yeah, I'm worried about Heretics. This is a team going into playoffs as cold as possible, and that's not what you want to hear. If things are going to fix themselves, they're going to have to do it very soon, because everything we've seen from this team leading up to this was like, oh, they could be like a finals contender. I had them number 2 in my power rankings going into this week, and I know a lot of other people did as well. They were tied for second in terms of standings, and now we're walking into the playoffs at the end of week 3, and we're like, is this team even going to win a game? Like, that's how bad this week was for them, and Perks is the biggest part of that. But again, nice win for Fnatic. Again, it doesn't really change my opinion on this team entirely. I'm still concerned about the completeness of this roster because of the bot lane and because of the top lane, but if jungle mid are going to be strong, if Humanoid continues to just win in the mid lane like he has been all split long, then they're at the very least going to be a very difficult team to take down, even for some of the more competitive rosters in the league. Now moving on to game 4 of day 3 here, and a battle between two teams doing relatively well for themselves right now. It's SK Gaming taking on G2 Esports, but G2's doing just a little bit better for themselves. That's the 3rd win of the week for them, 3-0 week for G2 to end off the regular season, and with this win, they're now at 7-2 alongside BDS, and because they beat BDS, they hold the tiebreaker. G2 with this win gets the #1 seed going into playoffs. Some things are just inevitable, basically no matter what ends up happening. BDS with that loss to Corp, honestly costing them in the end. SK couldn't quite get the job done to get themselves to 6-3 and guarantee themselves that 3 seed, but good for G2. I mean, honestly, this team is looking pretty okay going into the playoffs here. There are a lot of things you can criticize G2 for, but generally this felt a lot more like the formula that we got used to last year for this same set of 5 players rather than kind of what we've gotten used to at the beginning of the winter split here for G2. Player of the game is going to go to Hansama on the Aphelios. I think you could also give it to Mickey X on the Renata. Hell, you could give it to Yike on the Lilia, all of whom were really, really important and really good in this game because, like I said, this was a 2023 G2 kind of game where it's let's go bot, and let's go bot again. And that works for this team. It obviously worked a lot last year. Let's get Hansama rolling. Typically, you would want to do it on Kallisto or you'd want to do it on Draven, but they themselves wanted to take those things away. You wanted to play for, of course, the early game dominant champion Aphelios, and he gets to play into the notoriously bad early game champion Xayah. I don't really know what the thought process, if this is what you were going to do with this draft, but it is what it is. They executed their game plan anyways. It didn't really matter. They dove bot over and over and over again until Hans was just so out of control that he could win any fight by himself. On the Aphelios, Mickey did a great job of setting up a lot of this, but player of the game pretty easily is going to go to Hansama because he was the one that they entrusted with a lot of these resources. When I say this felt like a 2023 G2 game, I really mean this felt like a 2023 G2 game. We were really high on Hansama last year. A lot of people were talking about the bounce back, him coming back over from North America where he really wasn't all that good on Team Liquid and feeling like he really got his confidence back, playing a lot of these early game aggressive picks, trying to dominate in the isolated 2v2 like he had been so successful on in years past on Rogue and on Misfits. It was really good to see that. Obviously, we know now that it's a bit of a pigeonholed style that he's kind of been put into. He's not quite as good when he has to flex off of that style, but the style very much works, and they played to the strengths here. So credit to Hans, it was probably his best game of the entire split. Mickey looked a lot better here. I've been a bit concerned with Mickey. I don't think he's been awful, but I certainly don't think he's been the player that everybody kind of has wanted him to be. This is certainly not what he was in 2023. This is definitely a lot closer to what he was on Excel. I still think he's been fine, generally, like a middle tier support in the LEC, and obviously, if he ends up balling out in the playoffs, I'm not going to be all that surprised. I'm just talking about what I've seen so far, but Yike has continued to be amazing. He out-jungled Isma. There is a really high chance that this was kind of a battle between the 2 junglers that I was considering for my first team All-Pro at the end of this split, because Isma had that fantastic week #1, and Yike, I think, has just been generally consistent throughout the entirety of the split, and Yike dominated him. Isma had a really rough game, which we will get to, but Yike continuing to look awesome in every game. Caps got to take a step back, a little bit of a relaxation seat in this one. He's kind of had to carry this team all the splits, so it's really nice to see them go bot and actually be able to win the game. And Broken Blade was fine on the Cassante. He definitely outplayed Irrelevant in this top lane matchup, with Irrelevant getting his quote-unquote signature Jax pick. His Jax is obviously a signature champion, but his pro stats really aren't all that good on Jax, and so it is what it is. G2 looking pretty solid here, but for SK, this is SK Gaming. I mean, this is truly kind of the cycle that this team and this organization has gone through. It's, oh my god, the excitement is there. Week 1 looked really good, and then week 2 was a little bit worse, but you're not, like, off the train yet. And then week 3, it's like, oh, maybe they're not going to be able to compete near the top of the standings. Now, they still ended at 5-4, which is a pretty good record, like, if all things considered. It's certainly not, above 500 is pretty good in the LEC, especially when so many things are so volatile in the LEC, but you would have liked this to be a bit of a better end to your regular season. Exakick is going to get out of the game. Poor guy got dove over and over and over again. I almost feel bad for him. It wasn't even really entirely his fault, but he was the one that did get capitalized on for SK. I think you could also realistically give dead of the game here to Isma in the jungle, because Yike clearly had a game plan and Isma did literally nothing to stop it, and eventually SK lost the game because of it. This was probably the game where Isma got the most outclassed. He was a little bit weaker in week 3 than he was in the first 2 weeks just in general, but definitely worth noting that, I think this game was the worst of them all. This was probably his worst game of the split. Das really couldn't do anything on the Rakan. Exakick certainly couldn't do anything on the Xayah after getting 3-manned over and over again. Niski had some gold. I mean, that's really the only positive you can say. I mean, he was generally fine across this entire week, even with SK losing games. They probably shouldn't to teams like Corp, but Irrelevant had a pretty bad week just in general in all 3 games, and certainly in the final 2, he was outclassed in both of them, even on his signature Jax picks here. Like, SK just feels like they've kind of reverted to being just an okay team again. It's going to be interesting to see who they draw in the first round of the group stage, because I don't know if they're going to live up to, like, the seeding that they end up getting. I mean, it's very possible they get, like, the 3 or the 4 seed and go into a matchup with a genuinely good team, you know, across from them. They're not guaranteed to win that series in the way that they're currently playing. I still have a lot of excitement for them because I like Isma and I like Doss in particular. Niski's just generally been very good, but there are also reasons to believe that this team might underperform when we get into more important best of 3s. But for G2, this guarantees them number 1 seed. That's pretty big. It means you get to play probably GIANTX, which is obviously a much easier challenge than basically anybody else in the playoffs at the current moment, but you still got to be able to figure out some of your weaknesses. It was nice to see that 2023 G2 is still there, but that team had, you know, upside, and they had a ceiling, I guess I should say. They had a cap to what they could accomplish. I think playing towards the late game and showing that amazing macro that they have over the course of this split definitely inspired me to think that this team could do more. If they could combine these 2 styles into one complete package, I'm really going to feel good about this team, but until they show that they can do that on the Rift, I'm still going to look at them as a team that is very, very good at their absolute best. Maybe guaranteed the best in the LEC, but still one that I think has tangible flaws you can point out. And that's going to bring us to our 5th and final game of day 3, our 15th and final game of week 3, and our final game of the winter split regular season here in 2024. It's a matchup between Team Vitality and Mad Lions Koi, 2 teams sitting at 4-4. And Mad Lions picks up their 5th win to go above 500 to secure their spot in the top 4 in terms of the standings. Talk about a successful first split for 4 rookies and Alyoya. I mean, really, this is above and beyond what anybody could have anticipated for this roster, for this team. Very excited to see what they do now that they're given an opportunity to potentially have, you know, a little bit of an easier schedule than maybe people were expecting. I mean, people pretty unanimously thought that this was going to be a bottom 2 team in winter, that it would take some time for these young players to get something together, to figure out who they liked, who they didn't like, who they could stick with, who they needed to move on from. But no, you know, split 1, they're above 500, they're in the top 4, and that's huge. Vitality not able to get above 500, but still a really nice recuperation season, or I guess final 2 weeks from them after, you know, being 0-3 to start the year. They went winless in the first week to get to 4-5, to be pretty comfortably in the playoffs going into this final week. That's a really big positive for Vitality just in general, even though they weren't able to win this game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game was Alvaro once again, this time on the Blitzcrank. What a week for Alvaro. You know, Supa's kind of the player that I've been hyping up the most on Mad, where I've been looking at it and saying, like, this guy's, you know, a superstar, but Alvaro is kind of also a superstar in the bot lane. I hyped them both up a lot in the preseason, but even I couldn't have anticipated them both being this good. That's a lie. I said I really wouldn't have been surprised if they were a top 2, top 3 bot lane by the end of winter, and honestly, that's kind of exactly what they are. I mean, they're a top 2, top 3 bot lane in terms of what they're performing like right now. Now, can they extend this over a large period of time? That's certainly going to be more up for debate. We were saying the exact same thing about Exakick and Doss last year at the end of the winter split when they were phenomenal in the regular season, when Exakick was the number 180 carry in the regular season in the winter split, and you're just like, okay, now they're on the pathway to being superstars. Exakick has never really taken that next step up since then. Hopefully Supa and Alvaro can do that, but this Blitzcrank game was amazing everywhere on the map, constantly making plays, making life a living hell for basically every Vitality player, most specifically Hillisang on his Pyke. Really just a great game from Alvaro and a great final week from Alvaro. He was one of the best players in the entirety of the LEC over the course of this week, and that was very clear. Supa also a great game here. I think both of them have been near the top of their roles in terms of what they've been able to perform like in the winter split. I think Supa's probably going to get a bit more credit because honestly, there just aren't as many good AD carries as there are supports right now. There are a lot of supports that I think have been performing very high, or at a very high level. You know, Labrav, I think, has been very good. Kaiser, for most of this split, has been very good. Alvaro is in that conversation as well, but, you know, there really aren't a lot of AD carries who have played well this split, and Supa, I think, separates himself a bit in that department, but very much capitalized on everything the Blitzcrank did in this game, and just generally, these two have amazing synergy in the bot lane. I'm really excited to see if they can continue to grow as a duo. Frescoe looked really good this split, really wasn't a superstar in a lot of their games, never really was the one they were giving a lot of the resources to, but was so consistent at being able to just either go even or win lane and then be very useful in team fights. I mean, a player that I think he played a lot like over the course of this this split was Nuke for BDS. I think they actually gave very similar outputs. I think Nuke was a bit better, but Frescoe very much impressed me as somebody who I wasn't super excited about this split. Elyoya was awesome, as we all projected him to be. He consistently won jungle matchups and created a ton of pressure for his laners. And Merwin was so fun, pulling out Varus and Fiddlesticks earlier this week in the top lane. Just a really intriguing player and a really fun team. I'm really happy for Mad that they were so successful in the first part of this new rebuild, this new Spanish roster that they wanted to go with. So far, at the very least, it's definitely a success, but for Vitality on the other side, you're not too perturbed, I think, by this loss. Hylissang had a little bit of the Hill-Insang in this one, which you get every once in a while. He's going to get dead of the game on the Pike. He's really fun and really good on this champion, but sometimes he goes a little bit too deep, and especially when you're going into a Blitzcrank, if that Pike gets hooked, he is dead. There is simply nothing he can do to get out of those situations, and oftentimes he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And what's going to happen? Hylissang is not a perfect player. He really hasn't been all that great over the past couple of years. I thought 2022 was, for the most part, a bad year for him, especially in the summer split. I thought 2023 was actually a lot better than people were giving him credit for, maybe with the exception of summer, where, he was seceding a little bit of that pressure to Carzzy, but generally I thought he was pretty good last year. I certainly had a higher opinion of him than most other people did, but he's not been great to start this year. I think Carzzy certainly had his ups and downs, but both of these two bot lane members were really bad in week number 1, but I think Carzzy recovered a little bit better than Hylissang did, who's still kind of flipping games, basically for no reason. I do think this was maybe Douglas's best game in a while. He's had good games. I don't want it to seem like he has been a complete liability for this team. I just don't really know if I trust him in the jungle. He was the other positive piece here, but VTO, not particularly great here in the mid lane on the Orianna. Carzzy did basically nothing on the Varus. Once Hylissang started running it down, Supa and Alvaro gained full control of that bot lane matchup, and Carzzy really didn't get to do anything this game, and Photon was Cassante on the top. He had a good game, but really, what did he have to do in this one? So overall, really not a bad game for Vitality. You're not worried again. You're not freaking out really in any sort of capacity. You're just kind of looking at this and being like, well, they're probably not that great of a team. They're probably fine, but their weaknesses are pretty clear. If Hylissang and Carzzy have good games, I think this team can compete with a lot of the teams that are above them in the standings. Teams like SK, teams like, Mad Lions, a team like Fnatic. I think Vitality could be able to compete with those rosters if, Hylissang and Carzzy are playing well, and if you get VTO on something he's more comfortable on. But for the most part, you're really relying on Photon and VTO to really carry a lot of games, and just hoping that you get that version of Hylissang. When they're in their bad state, they're a bottom 4 team in the league, and that's just kind of how it is right now. So generally, this is kind of how I expected it to go. Vitality with the loss, Mad with the win. Very, very great end to the winter split here for Mad, but it's not really about what you do in the regular season. It's about what this young roster can achieve now that we're moving into the best of 3 and best of 5 stage, and they put themselves in the best position and the best spot to potentially get a really nice circumstance in that regard. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC week number 3 overview and analysis video of the winter split. That wraps up our winter split regular season coverage on this channel. The next thing that we get to cover, the LEC winter split group stage and playoffs. I guess it's all technically the playoffs now, at least on Leaguepedia. It's all categorized as one big playoffs, which you would consider to be maybe a format change, but in reality, it ends up working the exact same, except the sides and the groups are just the sides of the bracket. So 1, 8, 4, and 5 are on one side, and then 2, 7, 3, and 6 are on the other. I don't know why it took me so long to figure that out, but that ends up being how it breaks down up on the screen. Now you can see where these teams fell in terms of their seeding going into that tournament. Of course, no ties. There are ties in terms of game score, but no ties in terms of how it actually is going into the playoffs. We know the seeds of all of these teams going into the playoffs, and so they are listed as such. Of course, you can see all the teams that qualified in green, the 2 teams that did not qualify in red, Rogue and K-Corp, ending their split in the bottom 2. But in the first column to the right, you can see my personal power rankings of these teams. In the second column to the right, you can see how they have changed from last week to this week. Very, very few changes, which is going to surprise some people because there were upsets this week. There were performances that weren't particularly good, but the only change that really happened is Heretics falling from 2 to only 4. I know there's going to be people that want to see them go lower, but do I truly believe that Heretics is worse than SK Gaming? Do I really think they're worse than Mad Lions? Do I really think they're worse than Vitality? Maybe they'll lose a game to these teams, but right now, I can't look you in the eyes and guarantee that this team is going to be worse than those teams who were just also so inconsistent. It's really hard to get a good read on where these things lie, but you can kind of get a good idea of who is maybe a little bit overreaching in terms of their seeding and who's a little bit underreaching. The matchups are determined, G2 versus GIANTX, and then in that same side of the bracket, Mad Lions taking on Fnatic. That's certainly interesting, and, you would expect G2 and Fnatic to be able to get out of that, but, we'll see. And then the other side, of course, BDS taking on Team Heretics, one of the most interesting first-round matchups, and then on that same side, SK Gaming and Vitality. It's really open outside of BDS on who could get out as the second seed into that top 4 and into the best of 5 stage from there, but would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions down below. Do you agree with my few changes, only moving BDS and Fnatic up 1 spot and Heretics down 2, or do you think there should be more? I'm really interested and curious to hear what you guys think down in the comments section below, but it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week, and something a little bit extra here at the end of week number 3, and that's going to be my all-pro team and my MVP selection, I guess you could say. We'll get into player of the week and dud of the week first, because I think that's a pretty important thing to talk about before we talk about the entire split as a whole. Player of the week for me, this one was at least a little bit difficult, but also kind of easy. It's going to go to Caps, the mid laner for G2. Ridiculously good split he has had. I don't know why I said that like Yoda, but he's been phenomenal for G2 across the entire split so far. He has carried so many different games for them. He's been a focal point that they can play through in the late game in particular, and, I think he's really kept that team alive at times where the rest of them have been struggling a bit. It's not just him, clearly, the rest of the team did play well this week, but a 3-0 week for G2. Caps deserves that honorable mention, or I guess that main mention for player of the week here. In week number 3, my honorable mentions, one's going to go to Alvaro. He was very close to getting this award as well. He was great for Mad Lions this week, but as a playmaker, as somebody that they could play through in the bot lane, enabling his really good AD carry, that bot lane is really working. You'll see it, but there are people that could consider them a top 1 bot lane in the LEC right now in terms of performance, and, I think they're at least in the conversation for that, which not a lot of people would have anticipated, but Alvaro was fantastic this week. And then the other honorable mention, it's gonna go to Bo, the jungler for Corp. Finally, they've got somebody in the good section of this player of the week, dud of the week section, but Bo was awesome the entire week, was really good, still made a couple of boneheaded plays in the mid game, but everything outside of that was phenomenal. You take the bad, because of the good with Bo, like you're going to live with the fact that he's going to have a couple of bad plays because the good is so good. They finally started to play into him. He unlocked himself a bit to really move around the map and be a big nuisance for a lot of teams to play against here, so Bo definitely deserving an honorable mention, and those are my 3 kind of standouts, Caps in particular, as my player of the week. And then my dud of the week, come on, this was a no-brainer. This one goes to Perks. There was nobody else even remotely in contention for this. This was the worst week anybody had in the LEC in the winter split, and it wasn't particularly close. That includes Corp members over the first 2 weeks. This was miserable from Perks. He cost his team a ton of momentum, and honestly, he does not look very good right now. He is a major part of what Heretics is doing as a team at the current moment, and if he's not going to play well, that's really bad for Heretics, because it's not going to get easier from here. They're definitely on the harder side of the bracket, which I think is something worth noting, but at least for now, you gotta hope that he's gonna be able to turn it around when games get a little bit more serious in the best of 3 and best of 5 stages like he's been able to do in years past. But that's my player of the week and my dud of the week. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, I'm gonna be going over my all-pro team now as well, giving you my picks and then players that I also considered for that role. In the top lane, my all-pro pick here is gonna go to Adam. This is not a surprise to anybody who has watched the channel. I didn't even really consider anybody else for this. He was pretty clearly the best top laner in the LEC this split. I don't even think there was really anybody else that was crossing my mind. Some people are going to want to see Irrelevant on this list, but he was really bad in week number 3, and outside of that, who is it? Like Photon? Is it Wonder? Like, it really was Adam. Adam was the best top laner in the LECs. This is not the first time I've been giving him my first team all-pro for a split, but with the small 9-game sample size, it definitely goes to Adam from BDS. In the jungle, this one was definitely the hardest one for me to choose, but I ended up going with Yike, the starting jungler for G2. It was either him or Isma. Unfortunately, that final game of the season really tipped me over the edge in terms of Yike. Maybe he wasn't the one getting a lot of the player of the game awards, which is definitely something that I use to kind of nudge me in a direction on some of these players. He didn't get a lot of those because Caps ended up getting a lot of them for G2, but his impact on the game was undeniable. He was the most valuable jungler to his team, and so he's going to get first team. But again, Isma definitely deserves an honorable mention, especially as a rookie. What a fantastic start to his LEC career. Maybe he can rebound from what was kind of a rough week number 3. Mid lane was also not particularly particularly difficult. I'm going to give it to Caps, and he's not just going to get my first team All-Pro, he's going to get my MVP of the winter split. Anybody who's been following the channel knows that this is not a particularly controversial take in my mind. He deserves this. He was the best player in the winter split, and it wasn't close. He was so valuable to his team. G2 would not be anywhere near where they are in the standings without how Caps played. Definitely deserves that spot as first team All-Pro and as MVP, but there were a lot of good mid laners. Humanoid very narrowly coming in second place. I feel bad that Humanoid had the split that he had and can't get on the All-Pro team, but Caps was awesome, and Humanoid's honestly second place in terms of MVP voting, and I would argue Adam is probably third. Maybe Lebrav is third. We'll get into that in a second, but you know, VTO, somebody that I think also played relatively well, but really, this was between Caps and Humanoid, and Caps was going to be the one to end up taking that. Now, AD Carry, take your pick, man. Like, I'm going to give it to Supa, because he got the most player of the game awards for me, and honestly, I don't really feel more comfortable about anybody else in the league, but I mean, truly take your pick. I don't really think there was any standout AD carry in the league that I felt very good about putting in my All-Pro team. I truly do believe that Supa was given the most amount of resources and was able to do the most for his team, was given the biggest responsibility for his team's wins in terms of the AD carries, and so he is going to get this spot. But if you want to give it to Ice, who was probably more consistent over the course of the whole split, even though he had a much smaller role for a team that wanted to play through different areas of the map, then absolutely you could give it to him. I mean, who else? Like, I don't know, Flackid, maybe? Like, I don't know, Patrick, he was fine, I guess. There really weren't a lot of AD carries that I was considering for this role. Hansama's had a down year, or a down split. Exekit kind of had a down split. Noah certainly had a down split. Karzi was really bad in week number 1. Like, there just weren't a lot of options here in the AD carry role, and so I am going to end up going with Supa, but, you know, kind of begrudgingly. He's definitely the most contentious of these choices, I would say. And then in the support position, this one was not contentious for me. It's going to be Lebrav, the support for BDS. What an amazing split he had. He kind of cemented himself as the best support in the LEC. Maybe not in terms of like what I would predict, because Mickey X is still there, and even though he kind of had a down split, you would still imagine Mickey would show up in bigger moments, but Lebrav was the best performing support here. I think Alvaro was definitely a consideration for this. Like I said, Mad probably had the most cohesive bot lane, them and BDS kind of fighting it out for that, but I think Lebrav individually as a support showed me a bit more over the course of this split, and he was, you know, top 3, top 4 in my MVP voting. Whether you wanted to give him, you know, him third or Adam third, I think is up to you, whoever you think had a bigger impact on BDS this split. I think both are good answers, but you know, I think in general, Lebrav had a great split, and I'm really happy to be able to acknowledge that, but that's it. That's my awards. That's my player of the week, dud of the week. That's everything in the regular season covered. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like on the video. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. And it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Not only do we cover the LEC on this channel, but we cover all 4 of the major regions every single week on this channel. So hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when all those videos go live, including my coverage of the LEC playoffs, which of course is going to start very, very soon. I'm incredibly excited to get into it. I hope you guys are as well. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.